They say grief sharpens the edges of memory, but when I stepped out of the car and looked at the house again after nearly 16 years, I realized that grief didn't sharpen anything. It blurred, softened, erased in parts you didn't know were missing until you tried to call them back. The gravel cracked beneath my boots as I made my way up the path, the air full of the scent of pine and dust, and that peculiar weight only silence can carry. It was exactly as I remembered, down to the half-broken wind chime that hung by the front door, still spinning lazily in the breeze as if it hadn't been touched since the day I left. The key felt heavy in my pocket. Sarah's lawyer had mailed it to me with the death certificate and the will, a quiet envelope full of finalities I hadn't been ready for. She'd left me the house, nothing else, not the money, not the furniture, not even her books, just the house. Just this long wooden skeleton of our childhood, full of corners we never cleaned and windows that never quite closed. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, half expecting the smell of her perfume, but finding only wood and cold and something else I couldn't name. The furniture was gone, the floor bare, the wallpaper still peeled in the same place by the stairs. It was clean, not sparkling, not sterile, but emptied, like someone had taken their time removing everything personal. The rooms were darker than I remembered. Shadows lingered longer, even though the curtains were open and the sun was pushing against the glass. I walked slowly, touching walls I hadn't seen in over a decade, my hand trailing the way it used to when I was a boy, pretending each panel of wood held a secret door. The kitchen still had the old stove, the kind with rust along the edges, and the sink dripped exactly once every 15 seconds. I stood there for what must have been an hour, listening to the drip, thinking about the last time I saw her. She hadn't looked well then, pale, thin, her voice quieter than I liked to remember, but she had smiled when I said I wouldn't come back. The staircase creaked under my weight just as it always had. Upstairs, the bedrooms were empty too. Mine was still painted in that pale blue I had begged our father for. Hers was shut. I didn't open it. Not that first day. I went to the study instead, a room we never used as children but that she had claimed in the final years. Her desk was gone. So were the bookshelves. Only the old clock remained, its hands forever paused at 11:11, as they had been since the night of the storm when lightning took out the old oak in the yard. I should have left then, I think. I should have turned around and locked the door behind me and called the real estate agent the next morning. But I didn't. I went upstairs again. This time I opened the door to the attic. She'd cleaned it. That much was clear. The dust was thin, disturbed in trails like someone had been walking through it regularly. The boxes that used to crowd the space were gone. Only one remained, in the far corner, marked with my name in black marker. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I turned to leave, and that's when I saw the door. It was at the end of the hall, past the attic ladder, where there had never been a door before. Plain, wooden, no knob, just a keyhole. I stared at it, heart thudding, convinced it hadn't been there when I came up. I reached out and touched it. The wood was cold, smooth, newer than the rest of the house. Something about it felt wrong, not unfinished, not out of place, but watching. I backed away. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the guest room with the door locked, the key under my pillow, my eyes wide open in the dark. Every time the house creaked, I imagined footsteps. Every shadow became her shape. I told myself it was the wind, the plumbing, the usual things old houses do when they're settling. But deep down I knew that door hadn't always been there, and I knew without understanding how that it would open by itself. They say the dead leave behind a kind of silence that speaks only to those willing to listen, and I didn't know I was one of those people until the third night I stayed in the house, lying flat on the guest bed with my eyes open in the dark, the hallway lamp spilling its dim yellow light through the slit beneath the door. I had spent the entire day trying to convince myself that the door I saw in the attic wasn't real, or if it was, that it was simply a part of the house I had forgotten, some renovation my sister had done in her last few years, some sealed-off storage room she never got around to showing me. But when I finally fell asleep sometime near dawn, I dreamed of it. Not the house, not the attic, just the door. It was there, standing alone in the dark, a pale rectangle in a void that had no walls and no sky, and I could hear something faint from the other side. Music, distant, like it was being played through a wall of cotton, a scratchy old record spinning in a room no one had dusted in decades. I woke up drenched in sweat with the sound still in my ears, and I didn't know whether to cry or laugh, so I did neither. I just lay there, waiting for the silence to feel normal again, but it didn't. By the fourth night, I stopped sleeping altogether. I wandered the house at strange hours, opening cupboards and drawers, trying to find things that proved I belonged there, that Sarah had wanted me to return. But most of the drawers were empty, and the cupboards held only dust and the occasional curled paper scrap. I made tea at 2 a.m., sat by the old stove while the faucet dripped its slow rhythm into the silence, and thought about leaving. I couldn't, not yet. Something was anchoring me, and I didn't know whether it was guilt or curiosity or something stranger, something older, buried deep in the bones of the house. That's when I started watching the hallway at night. It began as nothing more than habit. I'd sit in the guest room, door open, the hallway stretching out in front of me with its crooked rug and peeling baseboards, the faint smell of old wood and something metallic drifting through the air like a memory someone else had forgotten to clean. The door to the attic was always closed, but I knew what was behind it, and I knew what stood beyond the attic ladder. I hadn't gone back up since the first night. I told myself it was because I didn't want to get sick breathing in dust, but the truth was, I was afraid. Afraid of that door with no knob and the way the wood felt too smooth, too clean, like it didn't belong to the house at all. On the 7th night, I saw it open for the first time. It was 3:33 a.m. exactly. I remember because I'd been staring at the old clock in the guest room, the one that glowed faintly in the dark with its green-tinted numbers, and I remember watching the minute flick forward like the last tick of something I didn't want to admit had been counting down. I didn't hear it open. There was no creak, no groan of hinges, just a subtle shift in the light at the end of the hallway, the way the air moves when someone enters a room. I stood slowly, not daring to breathe too hard, and walked barefoot to the edge of the hallway, heart hammering in my chest like it was trying to claw its way out. The attic door was ajar. I hadn't left it like that. I climbed the steps without turning on the light. The moon spilled through the small round attic window just enough to show the outline of the boxes, the insulation, the uneven floor. The air felt warmer than it should have been. Still, watching. I turned my head and there it was. The door, open, not wide, just enough to see that the space beyond was lit by something faint and golden, as though a lamp had been turned on inside. I should have run. I should have closed the attic and called the realtor and never come back. But I moved closer. The room inside wasn't large. It was square, with walls a little too smooth, a floor that didn't match the wood of the rest of the house. There was no dust, no cobwebs. The air smelled like wax and cedar, and something faintly floral, though I couldn't name the scent. In the center of the room sat a red armchair, velvet, old but clean, like it had just been reupholstered. In the far corner, a small round table. On it, a record player, the kind with the big horn and the needle arm you had to place manually. The record was already spinning, slowly, but there was no sound, no crackle, no hum, no music, just the spinning, a soft, endless loop. And then there was the mirror. It hung directly opposite the door, oval-shaped with a bronze frame, ornate and tarnished in places. It didn't reflect properly, or maybe it did. It showed the room, but the angle felt wrong, like the reflection was being pulled from a slightly different position than where I was standing. When I stepped forward, it didn't respond the way a mirror should. My movement came half a second too late. My hand, when raised, blurred at the edges, as though the glass was struggling to translate what it saw. I didn't step inside. I stood in the doorway, hands clenched at my sides, staring at a room that shouldn't exist, a room that no one had built, a room that opened itself at exactly 3:33 and spun a record with no sound. The air pressed against me, not like wind, but like something testing the space between us. I didn't want to look at the chair, but my eyes kept returning to it. Something about its placement, the way it faced the mirror, the way the fabric caught the light. It wasn't just an object. It felt occupied. I backed away, turned, shut the attic, went downstairs and locked the guest room door again. But it didn't make a difference. I lay awake until dawn, heart racing, breath shallow, ears straining for any sound that might tell me the room was still open. But the house had gone quiet again, and the silence felt less like a relief and more like something holding its breath. The next night I stayed up again, and at exactly 3:33 I heard it open. Not loudly, not with drama, just the sound of the air changing, the sound of something being allowed. And when I crept back upstairs and found the door open again, I knew this wasn't about the house anymore. It was about me. I told myself I wouldn't go in. I repeated it in my head like a prayer, like a mantra, like the only barrier between me and whatever waited behind that door at the top of the attic stairs. I said I would just look again, one more glance to confirm that I wasn't dreaming, that I wasn't losing my mind. that this room that opened itself wasn't some elaborate hallucination stitched together by lack of sleep and grief and the kind of silence that doesn't echo because it isn't empty. But when the time came, 3:33 a.m., always 3:33, I was already halfway up the stairs before I realized my body had moved ahead of my decision, like something inside me had been waiting all day for this moment and didn't need my permission anymore. The attic air was warm again, heavier than before, as if the room had been breathing behind the door all night, exhaling something that thickened the space. The door was open, just as I knew it would be, and the golden light still glowed faintly from within, casting long, soft shadows across the boxes and insulation. I stepped closer, slower this time, heart measured, breath shallow, as if trying not to wake something that wasn't asleep. The doorway framed the scene exactly as it had before. The chair, the record player, the mirror. But this time I didn't stop. I stepped over the threshold. The moment I entered, the temperature shifted. Not colder, not warmer, just different, like I'd crossed into a part of the world that played by different rules. The air no longer smelled of cedar and wax. It smelled faintly of lilacs, my sister's perfume. I knew it instantly, though I hadn't smelled it in years. My throat tightened, but I kept moving, slowly circling the chair without touching it, inspecting the space like I was afraid it would disappear if I blinked too long. The floor underfoot was smooth, polished wood, not like the attic floor outside. The walls had no seams, no corners. Everything felt a little too perfect, like the set of a stage built from someone's memory. And then I looked down and saw the cushion. It had an impression. Not deep, not dramatic, but there was no denying it. The velvet was depressed where someone had been sitting, and the fabric was warm when I placed my hand against it. Not ambiently warm, but body warm, like the seat of a car just after someone steps out. I drew my hand back instinctively, the heat shocking not because of its temperature, but because of what it meant. Someone had been there, not years ago, not days ago, recently, possibly minutes before I entered. I turned quickly, half expecting to see the door close behind me, but it was still ajar. The hallway beyond unchanged, the attic waiting like a breath held in the lungs. I turned back to the room and let my eyes settle on the mirror. It hadn't moved, but it no longer reflected the same light. The room it showed was mine, yes, but slightly different. The angles were wrong. The shadows stretched too far. The chair was in the same place, but there was no record player beside it. Instead, the mirror showed something I hadn't seen before. A small table in the far left corner, and on it a glass of water. I looked to the corner. No table, nothing there, but in the mirror it sat plainly, clearly, the light from the overhead fixture casting a perfect halo around the rim of the glass. I stepped toward the corner slowly, testing the air, the floor. Nothing, empty, but the mirror didn't lie, or maybe it didn't reflect. I returned to the chair, kneeled beside it. There were strands of hair caught in the seam of the cushion, light brown, a little longer than mine, curled slightly at the ends. I didn't need to guess whose they were. Sarah. It had to be. But how? She hadn't lived long enough to tell me about this room. She never mentioned it in her will, in her notes, in any of the half-filled notebooks I'd found in her desk downstairs. And yet this space knew her, held her, kept the echo of her presence warm and breathing in the fabric. I sat down. I don't know why I did it. I don't remember choosing to. One moment I was standing, and the next, the chair was under me, and the air shifted again. The record player clicked softly. The needle arm hadn't moved, but the sound began. Not music, not melody. A hum, low, vibrating through the floor and into the soles of my feet, up my spine, like the house had developed a pulse and was sharing it with me. The mirror's surface rippled, just slightly, enough to notice, enough to make me freeze. That's when I saw her. Not in the doorway, not in the room, in the mirror. She sat in the second chair that wasn't there, on the opposite side of the mirror, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on mine. She didn't look like herself, not the way I remembered her in the hospital, not the brittle, silent, fading version. This version was fuller, more alive, wearing the sweater I'd given her on her 30th birthday, the one she never wore because she said it made her neck itch. Her expression was unreadable, neither sad nor joyful, but intense, focused, the way she used to look at puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. I reached out. My hand touched glass, cold. But the air in the room stayed warm, and her image did not fade. She didn't move, but something behind her did. A flicker, a shadow, tall, gone in an instant. I stood up so quickly the chair scraped against the floor with a sound that didn't belong to wood. The mirror returned to normal. The second chair was gone. The glass of water vanished. The hum stopped. The record player was still spinning. I backed out of the room, stepped into the attic, closed the door. This time it stayed shut. When I got downstairs, I found the guest room light was on, though I hadn't turned it on before leaving. The clock read 4:12 a.m. I wrote everything down, every detail, every movement, every second. But the more I wrote, the more my handwriting began to resemble hers. I knew it was mine. I knew I was holding the pen, but the loops of the letters, the way the S curved, the slant of the E, they belonged to her. I stopped, looked at the mirror above the dresser. It was blank, just my face, just my eyes, except I wasn't blinking. Not yet. There is something terrifying about a sound that doesn't exist, not because it's absent, but because it waits for you to notice it before it begins, as if it isn't truly sound at all, but memory wearing a mask, a sensation that begins not in your ears, but somewhere deeper, in the marrow, or in the quiet folds of your brain, that store things you were never supposed to retrieve. I didn't know the record player had followed me until the morning after the mirror showed her face, when I stepped into the kitchen just after sunrise, and felt something vibrating under the floorboards, a low rhythm so faint that I thought at first it was the hum of the refrigerator, until I unplugged it and the hum continued. I stood very still, letting the silence press against me, and that's when I realized the hum had become notes, not a melody, not a tune, just isolated notes, sustained and flat, drifting up through the soles of my feet and nesting somewhere behind my sternum like the residue of an unfinished chord. The moment I tried to concentrate on it, it vanished, like it had only been real if I let it remain peripheral, if I didn't look it directly in the face. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I tried to clean, tried to stay grounded in the ordinary, in the sound of water running and the weight of dishes in my hands. But every few hours, the music returned, always faint, always when I wasn't paying attention, always from the same direction. At first I thought it came from above, from the attic where the door remained closed but never locked. But by evening, the sound was traveling, winding its way through the house like it was testing the acoustics, slipping behind door frames and under floorboards, never loud enough to locate, never silent enough to forget. It felt personal, intentional, like the music was following me, waiting to be heard, but only when I was alone enough to be honest with myself. At night, the sound grew braver. I lay in the guest bed, covers pulled tight under my chin, and stared at the ceiling as the melody swirled above me. There were no words, just a slow, rising pattern of notes that repeated with the precision of breath. I tried to record it, to catch it on my phone, but the recordings played back nothing but static. Even then, I wasn't sure if the static wasn't part of the melody itself. Around 3:20 a.m., the melody stopped. The house fell into a silence so deep I could hear the walls contract. I waited, watched the clock tick toward 3:33, and when the time came, I didn't move. I knew the door would open. I knew the music would return, but I also knew that this time, it would expect something from me. I didn't go upstairs that night. I stayed in bed, eyes open, listening to the soft creak of the attic door as it opened without invitation. I could hear the faint whirl of the record spinning, the needle dragging across grooves that no longer needed vinyl to carry their sound. I thought of Sarah sitting in that chair, her hands folded, her eyes on mine, the weight of unspoken things hanging in the air between us like unfinished lullabies. I remembered how she used to hum to herself when she was painting, small tuneless phrases that rose and fell like breath, and I wondered if this music had started with her, if the room had learned to hum because she had taught it how. The next day, I found the first recording. It was on an old cassette tape buried in one of the boxes I had brought down from the attic the week before. The label was blank, no handwriting, no date. I wouldn't have noticed it at all if I hadn't heard the faint hiss of magnetic tape when I moved the box. I dug out an old player from the hall closet, a battered thing with peeling paint and a half-broken handle, and pressed play. Static at first, then silence. Then at precisely 13 seconds in, the same melody. Soft, sustained notes. The same ones I had heard in my bones. My breath caught. I turned the volume higher. The tape didn't skip. It didn't loop. It played the melody straight through for exactly 2 minutes and 13 seconds, then stopped. And then I heard my voice. Not the way I speak now. Not the tone I would use for a recording. My voice, unsteady, cracked, whispering. It's not playing anymore, but I still hear it. I stopped the tape, rewound it, played it again. Same voice, same words. I had never recorded that. I was sure of it, but it was my voice. I played it over and over until the sentence lost meaning, until it became a sound like the music itself. Recognizable but unreachable. Mine, but not mine. I didn't sleep that night. I walked the hallways until morning, pausing at every corner where the music grew louder, lingering by the walls where the vibration grew warmer. I began marking where it was strongest with chalk, small crosses beside baseboards, under doorknobs, on the backs of cabinet doors. By the end of the week, the house looked like a map, a labyrinth traced in sound and silence, each corner a clue to something I hadn't yet earned the right to understand. The music changed on the 9th night, not entirely, just enough. The melody added a note, a soft dissonance that didn't belong but refused to resolve. I heard it in the mirror, faint and ghostly, when I passed the hallway where her reflection had first appeared. The record wasn't spinning that night. I checked. The room was empty. The chair was untouched. The mirror reflected only my face, tired and pale. My eyes ringed in the same shadows I had once seen in hers, but the music was louder now, and it was following me. That night, I sat on the floor of the attic just outside the open door. I didn't enter. I listened. The music began as always. Then, between the notes, words formed. My voice again, but this time not a recording. Live, breathing. I heard myself whisper from within the room, "You know the melody now. Come inside." And I did. They say mirrors only reflect what's in front of them, but I've come to believe that's only true in houses that have forgotten how to dream. And this house, this place that once belonged to my family and now belongs to something else entirely, does not forget, and does not sleep, and does not reflect so much as it remembers. I should never have touched the mirror, but by the time I reached for it, my mind had already given in, already accepted that what I saw there had become more familiar than the version of the house behind me. The mirror no longer imitated the space I stood in. It existed in parallel, the same furniture, the same chair, the same record player, but each element shifted slightly with every passing day, as if the mirror's world was evolving independently, watching and waiting, correcting for something I hadn't yet done. It began slowly, barely noticeable, a reflection lagging half a second behind my movements, a flicker in the corner of my vision that disappeared when I turned to look, the suggestion that my reflection blinked when I didn't, or lingered in its posture a moment too long after I had moved away, subtle enough to dismiss, until it wasn't. On the 11th night, I stood in the threshold of the room and watched the mirror through half-lidded eyes, pretending to be braver than I was, and I saw something impossible, myself sitting in the red velvet chair, head tilted slightly to the right, lips parted as if mid-sentence, while I, the real I, or the version I still believed to be real, remained in the doorway, frozen. It wasn't just mimicry, it was surveillance, and for a moment, that woman in the mirror, that other me, turned her eyes upward and looked directly at me, not through me, not with glassy absence, but with sharp awareness, and I felt the full weight of being seen. I left the attic without stepping into the room. The next morning I covered the mirror with a sheet. I told myself it was just a precaution, a way to reassert control, to quiet my mind and reclaim some boundary between thought and space. But the truth is that the mirror had begun to haunt the rest of the house. I started seeing its shape in the corner of other rooms, in the reflection of the kitchen window when it grew too dark outside, in the gleam of the bathroom faucet when the light flickered. Sometimes, just as I turned away from these surfaces, I would catch my own face staring back a moment too late, or not at all. I began leaving lights on in every room, opening doors that I'd once closed, closing those I'd left open, trying to force the house into a rhythm that obeyed logic, but it didn't work. It only made things worse. By the 13th night, I was dreaming in mirrors, not of them, inside them. I'd find myself trapped behind glass, watching myself move through the house like an automaton, watching the version of me who still believed she was making choices, who still reached for doorknobs and turned on taps and stared into shadows hoping not to find anything. In those dreams, I couldn't move. I could only scream silently, my breath fogging the inside of the glass, my hands pressed against it like the walls of a coffin. When I awoke, I could still feel the pressure in my fingertips. That was the night I touched it. The sheet had slipped or been pulled, there's no way to be sure, and the mirror was half exposed, catching the moonlight through the attic window in a way that drew my eyes like a magnet. I stepped into the room slowly, drawn by the weight of something inevitable, and when I reached the edge of the chair, I raised my hand and pressed my palm to the glass. It was warm, not body warm like the chair had been, but electrically warm, as if something pulsed just beneath the surface. For a long time, nothing happened. Then the reflection shifted, not the image, but the depth. I was no longer looking into a mirror. I was looking into a room identical to mine, but deeper, wider, and darker. The mirror became a window. I could see the back of the chair, the record player still spinning, but there was a second door in that room, one I had never seen before, just to the left of the mirror's frame, half open, spilling orange light onto the floor like firelight. I stepped back. The mirror returned to normal. My face returned, pale, eyes wide, but something behind me moved. I turned. Nothing, but the feeling stayed, like being watched from inside my skin. The next morning, I discovered that the mirror was no longer confined to the attic. In the hallway near the study, the full-length mirror that had once belonged to my mother now reflected the wrong part of the house. It showed the attic door, even though it should have shown the stairwell. I checked it from every angle. It had changed, rewired. It was showing me the room above, even when I stood on the ground floor. I placed my hand against it. This one was cold, completely cold. And yet, for a moment, the glass rippled, and I saw the red chair. By the 15th day, I had removed or covered every mirror in the house. It didn't help. Reflections appeared in water, in glass, in the gloss of photographs. The mirror no longer needed its frame. It followed me, and sometimes it whispered, not in language, in tone. Soft pulses, like a breath across the nape of my neck, like a voice shaping syllables just out of reach, just enough to make me lean in, to tilt my head, to ask, "What did you say?" But there was never an answer, only silence that waited like an open mouth. I found myself drawn to the attic every night, no longer resisting, not because I was curious, not even because I was afraid, but because the house no longer offered any other option. The hallway always bent toward the stairs. The air always smelled faintly of lilac and wax. And the sound, the music that wasn't music, began earlier each evening, vibrating in the walls, growing more complex, layering new sounds that felt almost like speech. I started writing everything down again, even the things that made no sense, phrases I would find scrawled in the margins of my journal the next day that I didn't remember writing. She sees through me now. Don't touch the mirror when it's breathing. The door's only closed when you believe it. And again, the same recurring phrase, always in my handwriting but never remembered, I am not the reflection. Last night I looked into the mirror one final time. The sheet had fallen again. The room was darker than usual. The chair was empty. But in the mirror I saw the second version of myself again. She wasn't sitting. She was standing behind me, smiling, and I was not. There is something profoundly intimate about finding handwriting you didn't know you were meant to see. The loops and slants of ink pressed into paper carrying more of the person than any photograph or voice ever could, because the hand that moved across that page once shook or paused or twitched in hesitation, and no recording captures hesitation the way ink does. I found the letters in the back of the desk in Sarah's old room, the room I had been avoiding since the day I arrived, the room I hadn't dared to open until the house made it impossible to avoid. The mirror in the hallway outside had begun to hum whenever I passed it, a low vibration that settled between my shoulders and made my skin feel 2 sizes too small. And one night, without knowing why, I turned the doorknob and walked inside like I had done it 100 times before. The room smelled like her. Not the version of her from the hospital, not the hollow-boned figure that faded beneath 2 white sheets, but the version from before, the one who laughed too loudly at the wrong moments, who wore old flannel shirts in summer and never remembered where she left her tea. The air held traces of her perfume, faint but unmistakable, and the curtains still filtered the light in that golden way she always said made the room feel safe. I stood at the threshold for a long time, expecting to see something out of place, something strange, like what I'd seen in the attic. But everything here was painfully familiar, a perfect preservation of her, as if time had circled around this space and kept it untouched while the rest of the house grew strange. The desk was old, older than either of us, a family heirloom we had always ignored as children, its drawers too stiff to open, its legs uneven, the top always cluttered with her notebooks, her pens, the mess of someone whose mind worked faster than her hands. I approached it slowly, running my fingers along the surface that still bore the dents and scratches from her restless habits, and I pulled open the top drawer. It slid easily, too easily. Inside were the usual things: pens, a pair of broken glasses, a dried-up bottle of nail polish, but tucked in the back, behind a stack of unused postcards, was a small leather envelope sealed with a thin strap. I don't remember undoing the strap. I don't remember sitting down. One moment I was standing, and the next, I had the envelope open in my lap and the letters laid out in front of me like cards in a tarot spread. There were 12 in total, all written in Sarah's hand. addressed to someone I had never heard of. The name repeated across the front of each envelope like a chant. Ellis. Not a last name, not a full name, just Ellis. I stared at the name for a long time before opening the first letter, my fingers trembling, not with fear but with anticipation, the way you tremble when you're about to read the part of the book you already suspect will change everything that came before. The first letter was dated 6 months before she died. The handwriting was neat, careful, more composed than I remembered her ever being. She wrote about the house, about feeling watched, about the mirror. She wrote that the room was returning again, that it always returned after 3 a.m., no matter where she slept in the house, and that it always knew her name. But she wasn't writing to me. She was writing to him, to Ellis. She thanked him for teaching her how to listen to the house. She said the room was beginning to respond, that it had shown her reflections of herself she didn't remember being, that the chair sometimes held warmth when no one had entered, that the record player no longer needed records, that the music was changing, and so was she, that the name she had forgotten was coming back to her in dreams. The second letter was shorter, disjointed. Her handwriting had become erratic, the lines slanting upward, words repeating. She said she saw me, that I had visited the room, that I had stood in the doorway and refused to come in. The date on the letter was over a year before I returned to the house. I had never been there, but she had written it as if I had, as if she had seen me through the mirror. She ended the letter with a phrase I've seen only once before, in the margin of my journal, scrawled during one of the nights I couldn't sleep. The reflection remembers first. Each letter grew stranger after that. In the fourth, she described the mirror moving through the house, appearing behind her in places it didn't belong, shifting angles so that she could never see the same room twice. In the sixth, she said the room was teaching her to listen differently, that the music was beginning to sing names, that the voice was not hers, not mine, not even Ellis's, but something older. She said she tried to write down the melody, but the paper refused to hold the ink, that every note she copied turned to dust by morning. The seventh letter was blank, just the name Ellis on the front, sealed but empty. The eighth began with a warning. Don't trust your voice when the mirror hums. She said the house had begun echoing her in real time, that she would speak and hear her own words repeated seconds later in a tone she didn't recognize. She asked Ellis if he remembered the room from before, if he had found a way to close it, if the mirror ever stopped watching. She said the house had never been meant for one person, that it needed a pair. The ninth letter was the most disturbing. It didn't mention Ellis at all. It addressed me, by name, in full. It said, "You will find this when you're ready to return." It said the mirror would test me, that it would lie, that it would beg, that the room was not a place but a decision, and that once I sat in the chair, I would remember everything, the name, the voice, the man who waited. She signed it with her full name, and under that, the words. I tried to leave before the music ended. That was my mistake. The final letters were written in pencil, shaky and smudged. She wrote about sleep paralysis, about seeing me at the foot of her bed, about the mirror, whispering names she couldn't say aloud, about the door opening on its own at 3:33 and closing just before dawn. In the very last letter, she wrote only one sentence. Ellis, if she finds the name, tell her not to speak it aloud. The ink bled through the page like it had been traced again and again. I folded the letters slowly, placed them back in the envelope, and tied the strap closed. I looked at myself in the mirror above the desk, and for the first time, I saw someone else blinking in time with me, but it wasn't me. There is a specific kind of disbelief that happens when you see evidence of a thing you know didn't happen, not the kind of uncertainty where memory fails or reshapes itself over time, but the kind that feels like something has reached back and planted a seed in your past that didn't grow until now, flowering in a moment you didn't choose, in a way you couldn't explain. It started with the camera, an old one, dusty and quiet, sitting in a wooden crate in the bottom of Sarah's closet, wedged between a stack of half-filled notebooks and a moth-eaten scarf I hadn't seen since we were both children. I recognized the camera immediately, though I hadn't seen it in decades. It had belonged to our father, a man who spoke more through lenses than language, who wandered through rooms with a detached grace, observing rather than inhabiting, and I remember Sarah taking it from his belongings after the funeral, swearing she'd fix it up, though I don't think she ever did. It was heavier than I remembered, the kind of object that carries time in its weight, and the leather strap was cracked with age, but the latch clicked open with ease, and inside the chamber, to my surprise, there was a roll of film. I held it in my hands for a long time, unsure if it would even develop, unsure if touching it had already ruined it, unsure of everything now that the mirror had begun to follow me into my dreams, where the corridors of the house looped into themselves and the sound of the record player had started narrating my movements in a voice just slightly too slow to be mine. I should have thrown it away, buried it in the woods, anything but what I did, which was drive into town, find the last remaining photo lab, and hand it over to a teenager with purple hair and a nose ring who barely looked at me when I said, "I don't know what's on it." They said it would take 2 days. The wait was unbearable. I wandered the house as if each hallway held a countdown, as if something would finally come to claim me once the film was developed and the images made real. I slept in short bursts, never longer than an hour, always waking to the same sound, footsteps just outside the door, soft and deliberate, never hurried, as if the one walking already knew where they were going and simply didn't need to rush. The mirror in Sarah's room remained covered, but I began to hear a faint clicking behind the sheet, the sound of a shutter, the mechanical hum of an old camera winding its reel, and sometimes, in the seconds between waking and sleeping, I would see flashes through my eyelids, white and sharp, like someone taking photos in the dark. On the second evening, I returned to the lab. The technician handed me the envelope with a disinterested nod, and I drove back to the house with it sitting in the passenger seat like a passenger I hadn't invited, a silent presence that knew more than I did. I didn't open it until after nightfall, until the clock in the hallway struck 3 hours and the walls began to breathe again, that subtle expansion of the air that always came just before the room at the top of the attic stairs decided to open. I sat at the kitchen table, turned on every light in the house, and slid the photographs out one by one. The first few were simple, a vase of flowers on the windowsill, wilted and dying, the hallway, empty, a shot of the backyard through the upstairs window, all things Sarah could have taken, all familiar, all explainable. Then I reached the 5th photo, and I stopped breathing. It was me, sleeping in the red velvet chair. The room was unmistakable, the smooth walls, the record player beside me, the mirror visible just in frame, but I had never entered the room while asleep. I had only sat in the chair once, and I remembered every second of it, every heartbeat, every chill along my spine. Yet in the photo, I was reclined, arms resting on the armrests, head tilted slightly back, eyes closed in a way that didn't suggest rest so much as surrender. The 6th photo showed me again, still in the chair. But this time there was someone else in the frame, standing behind me, just out of focus, tall, unclear, their hand resting gently on my shoulder. I turned the photo over. There was a date written in pencil, October 12th. That was 2 nights ago. I stared at it for what felt like hours. The 7th photo was worse. In it, I was no longer asleep. I was staring directly at the camera, eyes wide open, mouth slightly parted, but I had no memory of it being taken, no memory of being there. And in my eyes, something was missing, or perhaps something had already entered. The last photo showed the mirror, just the mirror, but instead of reflecting the room, it reflected a hallway I didn't recognize, long, endless, no windows, no doors, and at the far end of it, the figure, still, facing away. I gathered the photos slowly, my fingers trembling as I slid them back into the envelope. I didn't want to look at them again. I didn't want to think about who had taken them, or why, or what it meant that I hadn't known I was being watched. The camera still sat on the counter, lens tilted toward the window like it might take a photo on its own, and I reached for it, intending to smash it, to end whatever link it had to the room, to Sarah, to whatever thing now circled the house like a clock hand waiting for midnight. But inside the camera was a new roll of film, unlabeled, fresh. I hadn't loaded it. I hadn't touched it since I brought it home. I closed the back without removing it. I locked it in the drawer of Sarah's desk. And that night, as the door to the room opened again, I stood at the bottom of the attic stairs and listened to the shutter clicking in the dark, over and over, as if someone on the other side of the mirror had decided it was my turn to be documented. By now, I had stopped pretending the house was still behaving like a house. It no longer responded to my attempts at normalcy, no longer respected the structure it once held, and every hallway I walked felt slightly longer. Every stair creaked underfoot like it hadn't the day before. Every window seemed to frame a view that wasn't quite the same each time I looked through it. But it wasn't until I saw the door move that I understood how far the change had spread, how deeply the room had embedded itself in the house and, worse, in me. It started subtly, like everything else. Small changes I could justify at first. The attic door no longer squeaked when it opened. The golden light that spilled from the room at 3:33 a.m. began to stretch into the hall earlier, until it touched the top step of the staircase even before I reached it. Then the frame of the door shifted slightly to the left. Then the hinges changed color. Then the threshold lowered just a bit. I chalked it up to memory, exhaustion, tricks of shadow and silence, until the door was no longer in the attic at all. I found it in the kitchen. It stood where the pantry had been, nestled between the fridge and the back door, a perfect replica of the same plain wooden structure I had first discovered weeks ago. The same smooth surface, the same absence of knob, the same thin keyhole I had never once used. I stood in the doorway to the kitchen and stared at it, knowing full well it hadn't been there the night before. The pantry was gone. No food, no shelves, just the door, closed, still, waiting. I didn't touch it. I didn't speak. I backed out of the kitchen and returned to the hallway, heart pounding, unsure if what I'd seen would remain there once I looked away. But when I came back a few minutes later, it was still there, unchanged. That night, I found it again, this time in the guest room. I woke just after 3 with the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone, that the air had thickened, that the silence wasn't silent at all, but full of breath, not my own. I turned on the bedside lamp and froze. The closet was gone. In its place, the door, closed, as if it had always been part of the room. The reflection in the mirror confirmed it. The door behind me was real. I approached it slowly, barefoot, careful not to make a sound, and I leaned in, listening for music. Nothing, just the faintest hum, like the walls remembering a sound they had once contained. I reached out, hand trembling, and touched the surface. It was warmer than the air around it, pulsing softly beneath my fingertips, almost as if it were breathing. I stepped back, left the room, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the door was gone. The closet had returned, the shelves untouched. But something had changed, not just in the house, in me. I began seeing corners where there were none, began feeling drafts from walls that shouldn't have allowed wind, began hearing the faint sound of footsteps behind doors I hadn't opened. And the worst part was that the door no longer waited for night. It began appearing during the day. I saw it in the mirror in the living room. At first, just a sliver of wood where the bookcase should have reflected. Then more. Then the entire frame. When I turned to look over my shoulder, there was nothing. But in the mirror, it stood tall, patient, certain. And then, slowly, deliberately, it opened. I turned again. Still nothing. The room behind me was empty. But in the mirror, the door opened wider. And for the first time, I saw what was on the other side. Not the red velvet chair, not the record player, not even the mirror. I saw a hallway, long, narrow, windowless, lit from above by a sickly, flickering light. And in the distance, something moving, slow, measured, toward me. I spun away, heart racing, bile in my throat. I covered the mirror with the closest thing I could grab, an old blanket from the couch, and backed out of the room, eyes never leaving the covered shape. I didn't return for hours. When I finally peeled back the blanket, the reflection was normal again. But the feeling remained, the feeling that the door had opened in more than one place, that I had seen something I wasn't meant to see yet, that I had been seen in return. The next day, the door moved again, this time to the basement. I hadn't been down there since the first week, and even then only briefly. It had always been Sarah's space, cluttered and unfinished, filled with boxes and half-assembled furniture, and I had no interest in reliving the memories that room contained. But that morning, as I descended the stairs to check the fuse box after the kitchen light began to flicker without reason, I found the basement rearranged, not by human hands, not by logic. The entire back wall was gone, replaced by a narrow corridor I didn't recognize. And at the end of that corridor, the door, open, just a crack, but enough. I didn't enter, I didn't need to. I knew now that the door wasn't meant to be opened by me. It opened to me. It had always opened to me. And wherever it led, it was coming closer. The door no longer waited for me to approach. It came to me, appeared where I was weakest, where I felt most alone, where my thoughts strayed longest. And each time it did, it lingered a little longer, as if gauging whether I was ready to step through or whether it should wait one more day. And then came the mirror, the one in the upstairs hallway, the one I had long since covered. I found the blanket folded neatly at its base, as though someone had taken great care not to disturb the fabric. The glass was clean, polished, and the door was there again, this time inside the mirror, facing outward, as if the room itself had turned, as if the door was now watching me. I stared at it for what felt like hours. I moved, it followed. I walked away. It waited. When I returned, The door was closer. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the hallway, watching the mirror, daring the door to move again. At 3:33 a.m., it vanished. The mirror reflected only my tired, hollow face. But just before the light flickered out, I saw a shadow where there should have been none. Not behind me, inside me. And I knew then that the door was not searching for me. It was remembering me. Because the door wasn't just moving through the house, it was moving through me. It began with a whisper I didn't recognize, one that came not from the mirror, nor the walls, nor even the room at the top of the attic stairs, but from the air itself, like breath pressed into silence, like someone leaning close enough to shape words with no mouth. At first I thought it was the house, and then I thought it was Sarah, and then I thought it was just the madness of exhaustion, the long, slow unraveling of logic I had been pretending not to feel. But when I heard it again, clear this time, closer, inside the bedroom while I was still holding my breath in the dark, I knew it was my voice. Not a memory, not a recording, not something played back from an old cassette. My voice, speaking words I hadn't spoken yet, forming thoughts I hadn't even had, whispering from the corner of the room like it already knew what I was going to decide and was trying to speak it first. The first words I heard were simple. Don't get up. That was it. A command. Soft and almost kind. I sat upright, frozen, listening for more. Nothing, just my own breath. I said it out loud in the same tone, trying to match it, trying to prove it wasn't me. But my voice sounded thinner, weaker, not the same. The one I'd heard was firmer, slower, more sure of itself. That night I didn't sleep, not because I was afraid of being watched, but because I was afraid of hearing myself speak again, of what I might say when I wasn't in control. I paced the hallway. I stared into mirrors I had already covered. I waited for the room to open and found instead that the record player had moved. It was no longer in the attic. It was on the table in the hallway outside Sarah's room, spinning, silent, the needle hovering just above the vinyl. The same record I'd seen for weeks now, the one that never made a sound, the one that seemed to play only in dreams. But now, as I watched, the needle lowered, slowly, deliberately, and the music began, not in the air, not in my ears, but in my bones. I didn't recognize the melody. It was soft and winding, as if it were searching for the shape of a song rather than playing one. And beneath it, my voice, clear, calm, steady. You knew before you arrived, it said. You just chose not to remember. I stepped back. The record spun on. I wanted to run. I wanted to grab the player and throw it down the stairs. I wanted to scream at the voice that it wasn't mine. But I didn't. I stood there and listened, because deep down I knew it was right. I had known the moment I saw the door for the first time, known when the mirror showed me a version of myself that didn't blink, known when I found the photographs. This wasn't discovery, it was return. The house wasn't showing me something new, it was showing me something I'd already agreed to. Later that night I found another tape, not hidden, placed, carefully, on the seat of the red velvet chair, labeled in handwriting that looked like mine, but too exact, too controlled, for her. I brought it downstairs, hands shaking, and put it into the old cassette player still resting on the kitchen table. It hissed, and then, softly, the music began again. But this time the melody didn't drift. It took shape, and under it my voice returned. You will try to leave. You will try to burn it down. You will think the room is a place. It's not. It's a function, a sequence. You entered it the moment you looked into the mirror. You won't remember agreeing to it, but you did, and now it's listening. I stopped the tape. My hands trembled too much to remove it, so I left it there and stepped outside for the first time in days. The sky looked unfamiliar, too still. The air felt artificial, like a backdrop waiting to be lifted. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked back at the house. It looked smaller, not physically, but perceptually, as if I were seeing it from a new distance that hadn't existed before, as if the house had folded in on itself slightly, drawing its edges inward to protect the thing growing inside. I stepped back through the door and found the hallway darker than it had been, the light bulbs buzzing faintly above like they were struggling to stay real. The next voice came from the bathroom, from the faucet, while I was brushing my teeth, just trying to pretend that routine still mattered. I heard it again, my voice, whispering through the gurgle of the pipes. You'll have to let go of the name eventually. I froze, toothbrush still in hand, staring at the reflection of my face. This time I didn't blink, neither did she. You're not supposed to keep it, the voice continued, echoing through the drain. Names hold form, and form is dangerous in here. I slammed the faucet off. I left the room, but the voice followed. It didn't always speak aloud. Sometimes it narrated, softly, from behind me, from inside the mirror, from the space between the walls. "She's walking now," it would say. Or, "She doesn't see the shift in the doorframe." Or, worst of all, "She's starting to realize this isn't the first time." And then it would fall silent, as if waiting for me to disagree, as if waiting for me to prove it wrong. But I never could, because part of me believed it, and that part was getting louder. I found another photograph taped to the back of the kitchen cabinet. This one was different. It wasn't a picture of me in the room. It was me outside, standing in front of the house, head turned toward the attic window, expression unreadable. Except I hadn't left the house in 3 days. I hadn't stood outside in that exact pose. I hadn't worn those clothes in years. On the back of the photo, in the same handwriting as the cassette, "Not yet." That night I heard myself speak a full sentence before I did. I was sitting in the attic, just outside the room, the door open, the chair empty, the mirror covered, and I whispered to myself, out of habit, I should close the door. But I heard it first, from inside the room, clear, my voice, saying it half a second before my lips moved. And when I turned, the chair was no longer empty. I didn't see her face, but I knew who it was, and she smiled. I no longer wake at 3:33 because I no longer sleep, not in the way that separates days from nights, not in the way that divides dreams from memories, not in the way that allows one to believe that waking is the truer of the two. The room has stopped pretending to open. It doesn't need to. It doesn't need to wait for time or night or silence. It simply is. It has always been. And now so have I. I don't remember when the line was crossed, only that at some point the door stopped moving through the house and began moving through me. The first time I felt it, I was brushing my hand against the hallway wall, searching for the light switch, and my fingers brushed not plaster but velvet, soft and worn and pulsing with the same warmth as the red chair. The wall flickered for just a second, and then it was gone. But I knew. I wasn't trying to find the room anymore. I was already inside it. It had folded around me gradually, patiently, and I had let it, distracted by photographs and voices and mirrors that no longer reflected but projected. I had let myself believe I was discovering something outside of me, some haunted place left behind by Sarah's death or our childhood or our father's silence. But none of that mattered anymore because the room wasn't in the attic or the hallway or behind the pantry door. It was in every breath I took, every step I made, every thought that arrived a fraction of a second too late to have been my own. I spent the last 3 nights in the chair, not because I chose to, not because it called to me, but because it was the only place in the house where I no longer had to think. The moment I sat, the noise fell away. The mirror dimmed, the walls softened, the floor stilled. The house itself seemed to pause, as if the chair suspended me from the rules I'd once known, as if by sitting, I agreed to be held rather than hunted. The chair remembered me. I could feel it in the way it adjusted beneath my weight, not reshaping but recognizing. The velvet molding to my shape the way a voice finds the right name to say. And the music plays now without a player. There is no record, no cassette, no speaker, just sound, constant, low, evolving. It comes from everywhere and nowhere, from the ceiling corners and the gaps between door frames, from the mirror behind the sheet and the creak of the staircase when no one is climbing it. Sometimes it's just tones, other times it's breath. But more often now, it sings. Not words exactly, but syllables that touch parts of me that ache when they're spoken. Sounds I can't translate but which my body understands. And I hum along, without realizing, without deciding. The voice is mine now. Not a reflection, not a mimicry. It speaks when I think and finishes my thoughts when I hesitate. It narrates not what I'm doing, but what I will do. Always in the same tone. Curious, calm, inevitable. She will return to the study. She will find the box again. She will know the name. And it's right, every time. Because I do. Because I always would. There is no more guessing, only remembering. I found Sarah's final journal in the floorboards beneath the bed. Hidden beneath a plank I must have stepped on 100 times without noticing the echo. It was thin, the pages torn in places, water-warped, the ink faded. But the last entry was clear, as though the house had preserved it while it let the rest decay. It said, "The room doesn't appear when it's ready. It appears when you are. And when you stop trying to leave it, you'll remember what it came for." I whispered it aloud without meaning to. The words fit too easily in my mouth. The name came later, soft, unbidden, rising up like breath from below the diaphragm, settling on the back of my tongue like something I had always known but never dared to speak. I said it once, out loud, alone, and the house answered, not with a sound, but with stillness. Absolute. As if every object and wall and door had stopped and listened and nodded. The mirrors cleared, the voice quieted, and I understood that there had never been a question, only recognition. I walked through the house then, and every door I passed opened before me. The kitchen cabinets, the cellar hatch, the closet in Sarah's room, all of them ajar, all of them waiting. I didn't open a single one. I just walked past, and they obeyed, and in each opening I saw the red velvet chair, reflected and multiplied, bending through space like a pulse through water. And when I reached the attic again, the door was gone, just wall, seamless. But I stepped forward anyway, and it let me in. The room hadn't changed, not in any way that mattered. The mirror was uncovered, the chair glowed faintly, and the figure in the mirror, the one I had once feared, the one who blinked when I didn't, she stood as I approached, and she mirrored every step perfectly, and I realized there was no difference anymore. I raised my hand, she raised hers. I smiled, she smiled, but only one of us moved first, and this time, it was me. I sat in the chair. The room accepted it. No music played, no voice whispered, only a deep exhale, like the house had been holding its breath for years and could finally release it. And then I saw the reflection change. Not the room, not the chair, the mirror. It no longer showed me. It showed the hallway. And in the hallway, a new figure, tall, still, facing away. I recognized her instantly. She wore my shape like a borrowed coat, her hands trembling with a question I already knew the answer to. And I understood then that the room wasn't something you entered. It was something you became. A shape, a presence, a function, like Sarah had said. A witness. The door had never opened for me. It had opened from me. And now it was her turn. They told me the base was empty, that it had been for years. A leftover piece of the war buried beneath polar ice and forgotten by time. They said it was simple protocol, a solitary assignment to monitor low-band signal drift and submit weekly reports through encoded wire. They said it wouldn't take more than 3 months, 4 at most, and that I'd be rotated out before the winter storms sealed the coast again. They didn't say why it had to be me, but I understood, or at least I convinced. Myself I did. They needed someone who wouldn't ask too many questions, someone who wouldn't be missed, someone whose medical file already made people look away when they passed in the corridor. And I was all of those things, especially after the tribunal, after the court decided I was no longer fit for command, but still useful enough to monitor wind patterns in the Arctic Circle. The trip north was long and quiet, the kind of silence that seeps into your bones and stays there even when the engines start again. We moved by truck, then a small prop plane, then another truck with tires higher than my waist, then sled, the final leg done under stars that didn't blink and a sky so heavy it looked bruised. The man who dropped me off didn't say his name, didn't meet my eye, just handed me the keys, a rusted clipboard, and a metal box containing rations, a sidearm, and a folded note that simply read, "Don't change anything unless absolutely necessary." Then he turned and disappeared into the white, like he was made of it. I stood alone for the first time in years, properly alone, the kind of aloneness you only know when you realize no one is watching and no one will check if you disappear. The kind that feels like a freedom until you hear your own breath and realize it's louder than it should be. The base stood ahead, nestled between 2 cliffs carved by time and wind, a low structure of metal and frost-warped wood with a tall antenna piercing the sky like a snapped bone. The door was heavy but swung open too easily, as if expecting me, as if never locked. I stepped inside, expecting stale air or rot, or that sharp chemical tang of abandonment, but instead, I smelled oil, dust, and something faintly metallic, like the air had been filtered recently, like someone had passed through not long ago. The lights were on, dim but steady, humming in the ceiling with that low electric sigh old wires make when they've been active too long. The generator was already running, deep, beneath the flooring. I could feel its rhythm vibrating through my boots, and I knew instantly something was wrong. The report had said the base had been powered down years ago, that I'd need to activate the generator manually upon arrival. But here I was, welcomed by warmth, by humming lights, by operational systems that should have been dead. I walked through the main hall, slow, cautious, not from fear but from the sense that I was trespassing, not into a building, but into a rhythm already in motion, a pattern I hadn't been part of but was now expected to continue. The rooms were familiar in their military sterility. Supply closet, mess hall, bunk chamber, communications post, all arranged in the precise geometry that made men feel safe during war. Predictable layouts to hold unpredictable horrors, but nothing was out of place. No overturned chairs, no loose pages or broken equipment, just silence and the faint trace of heat from machinery that had never fully cooled. I found the logbook on the operations desk, bound in leather with the insignia of the Royal Signals Corps still faintly visible under a layer of dust. The last entry was dated 5 years ago, but the ink hadn't faded, and the handwriting looked careful, unhurried, as if whoever wrote it didn't think it would be their last note. Just a routine update about antenna alignment and calibration drift. No mention of departure, no mention of emergency, just a slow fade into administrative silence. I unpacked my things in the officers' quarters, a narrow room with a single bed, a desk, and a mirror bolted to the wall. The mattress was firm but not moldy, the sheets folded with military precision. Not recent, but not untouched either. Someone had taken care of this space, or at least preserved its illusion. I sat for a long time, staring at the wall across from the bed, listening to the low drone of the generator, the occasional creak of ice shifting on the outer walls, and wondered if I had made a mistake coming here. But where else was I supposed to go? Back to the world that no longer wanted me, to the silence of tribunals and the eyes of officers who saw my record before they saw my face. That first night I walked the perimeter of the base from the inside, tracing the corridor that wrapped around the structure like a spine, taking note of doors, counting emergency rations, checking air vents, all protocol, all instinct, and I stopped only once, in front of the long corridor that ran east to west, the one that seemed darker than the others, longer than the building should allow. I stood there for several minutes, watching the dim light buzz at the far end. Something about it felt off, not wrong exactly, but deeper, like standing on the edge of a cliff and knowing the ground behind you is safe, but wanting to step forward anyway. I returned to my quarters and wrote my first entry, the pen feeling too light in my hand, the words too practiced to feel honest, but I wrote it. Anyway, because that's what we do, we document even when nothing happens. Because the act of recording means something happened, even if it's just the act of writing itself. I sealed the envelope and placed it in the outgoing box, though I had no illusion it would be collected anytime soon, if ever. But part of me hoped that someone someday might read it and understand that I had followed instructions, that I had arrived on time, that the lights were already on, and the generator already humming, and the door already open. I didn't sleep much, just lay on the cot with my boots still on, staring at the ceiling, counting the flickers in the bulb above, trying not to hear the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside, slow, even, and always stopping just before the door. But there was no one else here. They told me the base was empty. The second morning began without change, the same diluted gray dripping through the frost-covered windows, the same soft groan of metal settling in cold air, the same low hum pulsing through the floor from the generator that no one had started. I rose slowly, muscles stiff from a night spent more awake than asleep, boots still on, fingers cold despite the heat that should have been circulating through the vents. I didn't look in the mirror, didn't want to see the face I already knew would be drawn, pale and wide-eyed from dreams that weren't dreams at all, but something else, impressions maybe, or borrowed memories, the kind that cling to you. Even before you fully open your eyes, I walked the main corridor again, a mug of powdered coffee warming my hands more than it warmed my chest. The silence of the place had shifted, not louder, not even more present, just changed, like the building itself had started breathing beneath the hum. I made notes in the log out of obligation. Wind steady, signal consistent, no anomalies reported. The words felt false even as I wrote them, but I needed the ritual, needed the structure, the neatness of information over the chaos of feeling. Because the latter was already beginning to bend at the edges of things, I returned to the east corridor again, the long stretch I had avoided the night before. Not consciously, not deliberately, just a natural hesitation, the way your body doesn't enter a cold room even if the door is open. Today I told myself it was just another hallway, steel walls, exposed wiring, outdated fire suppression controls mounted at even intervals. I began walking it slowly, pacing my steps, counting tiles beneath my boots. 26 from the junction to the comms room, then a left turn, then 12 to the auxiliary storage bay. I passed both without pause, continuing on, unsure where the corridor ended, assuming I'd find a dead end or a stairwell, or maybe just the other side of the building, but I didn't. After 40 steps, I passed another identical fire suppression control, another wall-mounted emergency ration pack, another scratched panel where someone had carved a lazy circle into the paint with a tool. I stopped, heart slow but heavy, and turned back, only to find the corridor behind me exactly the same. No junction, no comms room, just more of the same corridor extending into a haze of fluorescent light and pale steel. I turned again, continued forward faster now, footsteps echoing too loud, louder than they should have in such a narrow space, louder than a single pair of boots should sound, and when I finally reached a doorway on the left, I turned into it with a rush of relief and found myself standing in the entry to the officers' quarters, the same quarters I had left 20 minutes earlier. The coffee mug sat on the desk where I'd placed it, still warm, the chair still tucked neatly under the table, my coat still hanging from the hook by the bed. I stared, blinking too many times, trying to rationalize, trying to remember if I'd turned a wrong corner or backtracked without realizing. But I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. The corridor had stretched forward, not curved, not angled, just forward, a straight line in a space that now folded. I left again, returned to the main junction, walked the opposite direction this time, past the generator room, past the storage lockers, past the old infirmary that smelled of antiseptic and dust, found the west corridor, and followed it, same length, same layout, same dim lighting. And when I turned into the first opening, I stood again at the door to the officers' quarters, as if the base had no ends, no corners, just loops, just reflections of the same few feet of steel repeated until meaning eroded. I spent the rest of the day testing it, marking the floor with chalk, dropping objects as markers, even tying twine from one door handle to another, walking carefully, deliberately, measuring steps, measuring breath. But the results were always the same. Turn left, turn right, walk straight for 20 meters, and find yourself back where you started, the hallway absorbing the signs, the chalk fading, the twine vanishing when I blinked too long. By nightfall, I stopped trying to explain it, and that terrified me more than the impossibility of it. The way I began to accept the loop not as a flaw in the base's architecture, but as a truth of the place, as if the building had been built around it, not by accident, but to keep it, to contain it, to feed it perhaps. And I realized that if I wasn't careful, if I kept walking long enough, I might forget which version of the corridor I had started in. I might not know how many loops I had made, or if I was already walking in the footsteps of a version of myself that had arrived earlier, or later, or never left. I returned to the quarters again, this time deliberately, no longer trying to test the corridor, but simply escape it. The door was open. The coffee mug was empty, the chair slightly pulled back, a detail I didn't remember leaving that way. I closed the door behind me and sat on the bed, pulling the logbook into my lap, flipping back to the entry I had written that morning, and saw a second entry below mine. Same date, same hand, slightly different phrasing, slightly different time, but definitely my handwriting. It said, "Tested corridor, loops confirmed, returning to quarters." Feels like I've already done this. I hadn't written that, not consciously, not yet, and I didn't remember it, but I remembered the feeling it described, the weight of repetition settling on the back of my neck like frost. I closed the book slowly, not ripping the page out, not crossing it off, just folding it shut like a question I wasn't ready to ask. And as I leaned back against the wall, I thought I saw movement through the slit of the door's window, a shadow shifting just out of reach, not fast, not threatening, just slow, familiar, maybe even mirroring my own. I didn't check. I didn't want to know. I told myself the corridor was empty, but then again, they told me the base was empty too. I waited until the third morning to open the drawer, not because I feared what was inside, though I did, but because I wasn't yet ready to admit how certain I was of what I'd find. I'd passed by the communications desk a dozen times already, eyes drifting to the drawer below the main terminal, the one with the rusted handle and the keyhole filled with dust, the one no one mentioned in the station schematic or in the welcome packet they gave me with its sharp corners and sterile instructions. And still I waited, running diagnostics that didn't need to be run, pretending the corridor hadn't trapped me again the night before, pretending the lights hadn't dimmed and brightened as if syncing to my pulse, pretending the sound in the vent wasn't a voice that hadn't learned language yet. The drawer waited too, patient and heavy, as if it had all the time in the world. When I finally opened it, it wasn't with a key or a tool. It wasn't pried or forced. I simply pulled gently, and the lock gave like paper, like it had never truly been shut. And as it slid open, I knew before I saw them that they would be there. The pages, dozens of them, thick stacks of standard issue field paper folded into a file I didn't remember assembling, held together by a black clip identical to the ones I used when I was still writing real reports. For real people, I stared down at them for a long moment, not touching, letting the air above them settle, as if disturbing the pile might awaken something in it. Then I reached out and flipped through the first sheet and found my name at the top, not printed, not typed, not forged, written in my own handwriting. My full name, military designation, deployment code, and location tag, all written in the exact formation I had been taught to use, with the little quirks I had tried to break over the years but never could. My G's that lean forward, my T's that curl too tightly, my lowercase L's that look like ones, and there it all was, crisp and steady, more confident than I had felt since arriving. And below that, a report, dated nearly 2 years ago, describing weather conditions, signal readings, and notes about perceptual inconsistencies within the Eastern Corridor. I read it again and again, heart still, hands trembling not from cold, but from recognition, because I hadn't written it. Not here, not in this place, not yet, but I knew the tone, the phrasing, the small habits I used when trying to sound more composed than I felt, and every word carried the fingerprint of my mind, but none of the memory. I turned to the next page, then another, finding a progression, a growing anxiety buried beneath the clinical phrasing, mentions of loops, repeated locations, the growing sense that time did not behave here, that space did not remain obedient, that voices called. Even when silence reigned, I pulled the stack onto the desk and sorted the pages by date, careful, methodical, needing to establish some order to the impossibility, and found a timeline that didn't make sense. Reports spanning months, sometimes days apart, sometimes weeks, sometimes all dated the same, but written in different hands that were still my own. One entry spoke of discovering the hatch behind the bookshelves in the records room, but I hadn't even been in that room yet. Another referenced dreams I hadn't had but recognized, images of corridors stretching into mirrorless dark, reflections that moved before I did, and always, the same sentence reappearing at the end of each log. Loop confirmed, memory unstable, identity retained for now. It was that last phrase that struck me most deeply. Identity retained for now, like the author knew the erosion was coming, like they were bracing for it, recording just enough to remember who they were before the place wore it away. I checked the back of each page for marks, for damage, and on one I found a fingerprint smudge in graphite, exactly where I tend to rest my thumb when writing for too long, and it matched mine perfectly. I held the page against the light, tilted it, watching the texture of the paper catch shadows, trying to see the past in its fibers, as if the ghost of who I had been might emerge between the margins. And then I saw the envelope tucked beneath the last sheet, creased but sealed, plain. Military stock with no address, just my name again, and the word "open last" written in the bottom corner in my own handwriting, smaller than I normally wrote, more compressed, like I had run out of time or space or will. I didn't open it, not then. I placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket and folded the papers back into the drawer, closed it slowly and sat back in the chair, trying to keep my thoughts from rushing forward all at once, because I knew what this meant, or at least what it suggested. Either I had been here before and forgotten, or someone had used me as a template for something I hadn't given permission for. A cycle, maybe, or a pattern, something repeating through the architecture of the place itself, imprinting memory into walls and wires. And I was only the latest to carry it forward. Maybe not the first, certainly not the last. The idea settled over me like dust, like the knowledge that you've been breathing something for too long to stop. Now I went to the mirror in my quarters that night and studied my face, looking for changes, for signs of duplication or fracture or layering, but all I saw were eyes too tired for the time I'd been here, lines forming that hadn't been there before, and behind them, something else, something watching me watch myself. Not hostile, not even unfamiliar, just patient, like the corridor, like the drawer, like the building itself. And I thought then, not for the first time, that maybe the reason they told me the base was empty wasn't because it was, but because they needed me to believe it was, because belief was part of the mechanism, part of the loop, part of the test or the process or the penance. And I thought about all the women and men who might have stood here before, reading their own names on paper they hadn't written yet, staring down corridors that led them in a circle until they forgot which direction they'd come from, and I wondered how many of them made it to the envelope marked "Open Last," and I wondered why I hadn't opened it. Yet it started with the ventilation system, or at least that's what I told myself, a faint clicking that repeated every few seconds just behind the bulkhead in the communications room, too soft to register on the monitors, too rhythmic to ignore. I pressed my ear against the cold panel more than once, pretending to calibrate the signal strength just so I could listen without admitting that I was listening. The sound wasn't mechanical, not truly. It didn't resonate like metal shifting or wires contracting or any of the usual thermal groans that structures like this release after enough time sealed in cold. It was deliberate, metered, like tapping, not frantic but patient. 3 slow pulses, then a pause, then 3 again, and then silence, sometimes for hours, sometimes for seconds. It returned whenever I stopped thinking about it, as if it waited for me to forget, just long enough to start again. I checked the schematics the next day, spread them across the desk in the observation station, tracing each vent line with my finger, every duct, every pipe, searching for anything that might explain the location of the sound, but the maps were incomplete, or wrong, or both. The eastern section where I'd first heard it wasn't even labeled on 2 of the diagrams, and the version printed with red ink, the most recent, showed the room as a sealed unit, supposedly disconnected from airflow entirely. I checked anyway, removed the panel, aimed the flashlight inside, saw only darkness and insulation, and the faint shimmer of frost retreating into shadow. I knocked once with the butt of the screwdriver, expecting nothing, but the sound came back almost immediately. 3 taps, precisely spaced, perfectly mirrored. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept the light on above my bed, the weakest bulb in the entire building, flickering every few minutes like it couldn't decide whether I deserved illumination or not. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling tiles, listening not to the hum of the generator or the wind dragging its fingers across the exterior, but for that faint rhythm. I didn't hear it, not there, not then, and I told myself that meant it was location-bound, that it didn't follow me, that it couldn't, but part of me already knew better. The next morning I tested the theory again, moved through every room one by one, pausing in each for at least 5 minutes, staying still, listening, documenting. I heard nothing in the mess hall, nothing in the medical bay, nothing in the officer's lounge, but when I stepped into the records room, a place I had avoided until then, the sound returned instantly, louder this time, closer, not inside the walls but inside the floor. I dropped to my knees before I could think, pressing my palm to the tile, feeling a faint vibration against my skin, not strong, but real, undeniable, like the echo of footsteps recorded through steel. I stayed like that far too long, breathing slowly, eyes closed, listening not just with my ears but with something deeper, something I didn't know how to name, and I knew, absolutely knew, that the sound wasn't random, it wasn't the building settling, it wasn't wind or pressure or pipes, it was a signal, but not from a machine. Machines hum, they whir, they buzz, they falter, they whine under stress, but they don't tap in patterns that match your own heartbeat when you're not moving. They don't pause when you lean closer. They don't hesitate when you hold your breath. The sound knew me, or at least knew I was listening, and something about that made my chest tighten in a way that no amount of cold could explain. Later that evening, I checked the signal monitor just to confirm I hadn't been wrong, but the feed showed nothing. The levels hadn't changed in 3 days. The receiver was functioning, the lines were stable, no environmental interference, no feedback loops, and yet I heard it again, this time in the stairwell between the operations deck and the auxiliary battery housing. The same pattern, 3 soft knocks, 1 pause, then 3 again, and this time it sounded less like tapping and more like breathing, shallow, timed, human. I turned quickly, expecting someone behind me, even though I knew I was alone, even though I knew the door had been sealed behind me since I descended. I didn't mention it in the log, not the next morning, not the one after. I wrote what I was supposed to write: environmental status, power regulation, inventory levels. I even recorded a note about the comm system's increased latency, something I fabricated just to distract myself from the real problem. Because if I acknowledged it, truly acknowledged it, then I would have to admit I wasn't just hearing things. I was being spoken to, and that kind of awareness has weight, the kind that presses on you when you're finally honest with yourself, the kind that doesn't let you go once you open the door. The sounds intensified 2 nights later. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it again, right outside the lavatory door, so clear, so immediate. 3 sharp knocks, spaced like a hand trying not to be rude. I froze with the toothbrush halfway to my mouth, spit gathering behind clenched teeth, and waited, eyes on the door, feet rooted to the ground. The lights flickered once, the plumbing groaned behind the wall, but no shadow moved under the door frame, no handle turned, no sound of retreating steps. And when I opened the door minutes later, the corridor was empty, perfectly still, and the tapping had stopped again. I sat on the floor of my quarters after that, back against the far wall, flashlight in my lap, knife beside me, though I didn't remember taking it from the drawer, and I wrote in the small notepad I kept hidden in my jacket, not the logbook, not the official reports, but something for myself, for what was left of myself. I wrote the sequence of sounds, the rooms I'd heard them in, the times, the pauses, the strange sense that they weren't always coming from the same depth, sometimes close, sometimes buried, sometimes almost inside my skull. I wrote until the pen ran out, and then I switched to pencil, and when that snapped, I simply sat, eyes open, listening. That was when the voice came, not words at first, not syllables, just tone, low, drawn, vibrating from somewhere beneath me, beneath the floorboards or beneath the skin or beneath the structure of reality itself, a frequency that machines couldn't register, but that something inside me had been built to receive. It lasted no more than 3 seconds, just long enough to stop my breathing, and then it was gone, and the silence that followed was heavier than the sound had been. I didn't leave the room the next day. I kept the light off. I didn't eat. I only listened, and somewhere, from the wall beside my cot, the tapping began again. Only this time, it didn't stop. I found the camera on the 6th day, not because I was looking for it, but because I had run out of things I trusted. The drawers had been emptied twice already, the filing cabinets combed, every locked panel either forced or quietly surrendered. I told myself I was conducting inventory, cross-checking supplies, fulfilling my assignment, but what I was doing, truly, was mapping what could still be counted, what still obeyed logic, and the list was shrinking. The camera sat on the lowest shelf of the supply closet, tucked behind a stack of discolored gauze packs and a rusted tin labeled with German characters that no longer meant anything to me. It wasn't labeled, wasn't listed in the equipment manifest, and it wasn't new either. Not vintage exactly, just old enough to have seen things I hadn't, heavy and black and smooth, with a leather strap curled beneath it like a sleeping limb. I lifted it slowly, expecting dust or disuse, but it was clean. The lens slightly smudged as if recently handled, the back locked tight, the film advance lever resisting with a soft click when I moved it. I pressed the shutter button experimentally, and it clicked with perfect clarity. No delay, no drag, the mechanical heart of it still alive, still alert. I set it on the table in the radio room and stared at it for several minutes, trying to remember the last time I'd held a camera that wasn't for documentation, trying to recall if I had taken pictures since the war ended, trying to convince myself that it belonged here. I opened the back carefully, half expecting to find it empty, but the film cartridge inside was full, and it wasn't new. The label was handwritten, faint pencil marks rubbed nearly smooth, PX07A, developed, do not expose. I froze, breath tightening behind my ribs. Developed, it said, but the film was still inside, still rolled and unprocessed, and I knew then what I would find, not because I had been told, not because I had read it anywhere, but because the air shifted when I read the words, like the building was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the mistake. There was a small box nearby, a light-proof developing kit. I don't know when I learned how to use one, maybe in school, maybe from someone who isn't alive anymore, but my hands moved without question, without permission, and I followed the process step by step, sealing the room, switching the bulb, hands gloved, breath shallow, silence absolute. And when the final rinse settled and I unrolled the film, what I saw didn't make sense. There were 7 photos in total, each one distorted, blurred, the kind of blur that suggests motion or replication or fracture. The first showed the hallway, the one I'd walked dozens of times already, but stretched somehow, longer than it should have been, the walls pulling outward like they were caught mid-inhale. The second showed the observation desk, but empty. The chair turned as if someone had just stood up, and a reflection in the glass above that didn't match the room's layout. The third was the stairwell, lit from beneath by a light that had never worked during my time here, and in the corner of the frame, barely visible, a shape that might have been a person, or something trying to become one. The fourth photo was the eastern corridor, unmistakable even in low contrast, but it had no end, no vanishing point, just hallway upon hallway fading into themselves like a mirror held against another. The fifth showed the supply closet where I had found the camera, but empty, bare, like it hadn't been used in years. No gauze, no tin, no shelves at all, and something scrawled across the far wall in thick black letters I didn't recognize. The sixth was of the medical room, the cot overturned, the cabinets open, and a line of ash on the floor that led out of frame, like something had been dragged or had evaporated as it moved. It was the seventh that made me drop the strip. It was my room, my bed, my desk. My face, I was asleep, lying on my side, hair draped over one shoulder, mouth slightly open, expression still, and the blanket pulled up to my chin, and the camera had been placed on the table beside me to take the shot from above, an angle that couldn't be reached unless someone had stood there, leaning over me, quiet enough not to wake me, deliberate enough to compose the image. I sat on the floor with the strip in my hand for what felt like hours, knees drawn to my chest, camera still on the table beside me like an accusation. I wanted to believe I had taken the photos myself, that I had sleepwalked, that I had imagined the entire thing, but I knew the timeline. I knew my sleep hadn't been that deep. I knew the position of the bed, the position of the chair, and I knew, beyond any doubt, that someone had been in the room with me, watching. I checked the door frame afterward, ran my hands along the latch, the hinges, the lock. Everything was intact, untouched, no signs of force, no scratches, but there was dust disturbed on the windowsill and a slight crease in the floor where the pressure of a footstep might have been, the kind that forms when weight is applied without intent to leave a trace. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I left the lights on in every room I entered, left the camera locked in the drawer beneath the transmitter, keys around my neck, pulse in my teeth. I didn't send the photos, I didn't write them down in the report, but I knew what they meant. The corridor didn't loop, the sound wasn't random, the drawer wasn't sealed, the camera wasn't waiting. It had been used, and not by me. Not yet. Didn't notice it at first. Not because it was subtle, but because it was too obvious. The kind of discrepancy your brain smooths over to keep things tidy. Like a missing tooth you only realize is gone when your tongue finds the space. I was reviewing the logbook on the seventh morning, trying to make sense of the last few days, to reconcile what I'd seen and heard with something measurable, tangible, documented. I told myself that writing would help stabilize me, that if I could plot events against time, I could reclaim some rhythm, some ownership of the experience. I didn't yet understand that time had never belonged to me here. The logbook sat on the desk like it always did, bound in that hard black cover with the white paper, just off enough in tone to feel prematurely aged. The ink didn't fade here, not even after weeks or months, and that should have warned me, but I took it as a sign of stability, of permanence. I flipped to the first blank page, only to find it already filled. Not in my handwriting this time, but something close, something too similar to be someone else's and yet just different enough to make my scalp tighten when I read it. The slant of the letters was mine, the way the date was underlined, the style of the timestamps, but the phrasing wasn't. It was clipped, colder, like someone performing the ritual of being me without understanding what it meant. The entry was dated the 11th. I stared at it, blinking, then turned back to the previous page where I had last written an entry dated the 9th, a long and disorganized account of the camera, of the photos, of my decision not to send them, of my choice to lock it all away for now, and I remembered writing it, the scrape of the pen, the slight tremble in my hand, the way my breath shortened when I wrote the sentence. There was no flash. I remembered the time, the silence, the low pulse of the generator through the floor, the sense that something was watching from the hallway but not ready to enter. But there was nothing between the 9th and the 11th, no 10th, no skipped page, no smudged ink to suggest I had torn anything out, just a seamless transition from my words to someone else's, and the date I had lived through missing entirely. I checked the wall calendar, the one I hadn't trusted since the day it showed the same sunrise twice, and it confirmed the 11th. I opened the comms terminal, and the system clock confirmed it too. I checked my watch, still synchronized, still accurate. And yet I remembered waking on the 10th. I remembered standing in the corridor listening to the tapping that had now become a lullaby of dread. I remembered the cold cereal, the hum of the lights, the moment the door to the supply room opened half an inch on its own and stayed that way until I touched it. I remembered the 10th, and yet it didn't exist. Not here, not in the record, not even in the scribbles I left on scrap paper in the margins of the manuals. I flipped forward through the logbook, page by page, looking for more gaps, and they were everywhere. Dates that should have been there simply weren't, like teeth missing from a smile you hadn't noticed was broken, and in their place were entries written in variations of my voice, some more precise, some panicked, some distant, but all unmistakably iterations of me, or of someone trying to wear me like a suit stitched from observation. I stopped at the 15th, an entry I hadn't written yet, which described the discovery of a second camera, one I hadn't found, in a room I hadn't entered. I closed the book carefully, not slamming it, not discarding it, but folding it shut the way you close the lid on something that might wake up if treated too roughly, and I sat back in the chair, hands pressed to my thighs, breathing slowly, trying not to imagine the implications. If the logbook was skipping days I remembered, it meant the record was not built from experience but from permission, that the system only documented what it had sanctioned. That time could be rewritten from the outside in. That memory here was malleable, not in the sense of forgetting, but in the sense of being overwritten like tape. And the worst part was knowing that if I didn't remember something, there would be no way to know it had ever happened. And if I did remember something the book refused to record, it meant I was resisting, that I was off pattern, off loop, diverging from whatever process was unfolding around me. It meant I was becoming a problem. That night I sat with the book open in my lap, staring at a blank page, not writing, just watching, waiting to see if words would form on their own. They didn't, not while I watched, but when I blinked too long, when my thoughts drifted, the ink was there again, faint at first, like water soaking into linen, then stronger, bolder, until I could read the words clearly. Don't look away when it starts again. I dropped the book and backed away, heart pounding, mouth dry. The phrase etched into my mind like a scar before it had even healed. I wanted to believe I had written it, that I had sleepwalked or lost time or forgotten something trivial, but the truth was simpler and far worse. Something else was writing in the logbook, something that knew how I thought, how I structured my sentences, how I formed my letters, and it was leaving messages between the lines of days that didn't exist. I didn't sleep, not that night. Not the next sleep felt like an invitation now, a chance for the pages to turn without me, for memories to shift and rearrange into something more convenient for the structure, and I knew, with the clarity that only silence brings, that if I allowed myself to drift, I might wake up having agreed to something I hadn't understood. I began hiding my own notes, scraps of paper tucked behind loose panels, phrases carved into the underside of drawers, short entries scribbled in the margin of old manuals. A second memory, a shadow archive, something the book couldn't rewrite. I checked them each morning, memorized their order, their phrasing, looking for changes, for signs of duplication, of intrusion. And on the 17th morning, I found a line I hadn't written carved beneath the cot in my quarters, small, precise, like etched with a scalpel. You forgot yesterday. We didn't. I began keeping the lights on, not to see better, but to remind myself that I hadn't drifted out of time again, that the bulb above my desk still flickered in that soft, irregular pulse I'd memorized without realizing, that the glow in the hallway still ended where the corridor bent toward nothing and folded back in on itself like a breath held too long. I left switches flipped even when I wasn't in the room, even when I knew that light in this place was an illusion of control and not an actual defense against the thing that watched me write, the thing that answered when I thought too loudly, because I had started to believe that whatever this was, whatever it had become, responded not to movement or sound, but to attention, that watching it made it stronger, and that forgetting gave it permission to rewrite. The knocking returned on the 19th night, softer than before but closer, not in the vents or walls or floor, but in the door to my quarters. 3 short taps, a breath between, each measured like someone used to being ignored and not willing to speak until they were invited. I stayed still for a long time, sitting at the foot of the bed with the logbook open in my lap and the page completely blank because the pen had dried 2 hours earlier and I hadn't noticed. The tapping came again, this time not just sound, but weight, a presence on the other side of the door, the wood bending ever so slightly inward with each knock, and I whispered into the dark without realizing. I had opened my mouth. I whispered stop, and it did, immediately. Like it had only been waiting to be acknowledged. I didn't open the door that night. I didn't move until morning, and even then it was with the slow caution of someone leaving an open cage. Not because I expected to be attacked, but because I had started to understand that fear wasn't the currency here, that whatever was in this place wanted attention more than submission, that it wanted to be known, and I was giving it shape just by looking too long, by remembering too clearly, by refusing to forget the blank pages and the photos that should not exist. Later that day, I walked the corridor again, east to west, counting each light fixture, each panel, marking them with chalk I had found in the bottom of an engineer's kit, just to prove to myself that the loop was still active, that the structure still bent itself into circles around me. But when I reached the sixth fixture and turned into the hall toward the records room, I didn't find the door. There was nothing, just more corridor, identical walls, identical fixtures, the chalk marks missing from the baseboards like I had never walked this stretch before, like I was moving through a newly rewritten piece of the base, and my throat tightened because I realized the map in my head no longer matched what was around me, that I was now walking blind inside a place that had erased itself mid-step. I turned back, hurried now, not running, but fast enough to break the rhythm of the loop, and the lights dimmed slightly with each stride. Just a flicker, just a shudder in the current, but enough to tell me I was being followed or watched or measured. And then the voice spoke, not in my ear, not in the air, but in the marrow of the corridor itself, a voice so embedded in the steel and the wire and the cracked paint that it didn't echo, didn't vibrate, didn't carry. It simply existed, present and complete, a sound without source. "You're still here?" That's all it said. 3 words, spoken in a tone that was neither surprise nor recognition, not mockery, not inquiry, just something close to fatigue, like a neighbor you hadn't seen in years opening their door and realizing you'd never moved away after all. A voice like a mirror of mine, not in pitch, but in posture, in cadence, in the way the consonants landed too softly, and I stopped walking immediately, heart stalling in my chest like an engine taking on water. I turned slowly, but there was no one, not even a shadow, just the hum of the hallway returning to itself and the air thickening with the weight of what I had heard. I stood there for what might have been an hour, maybe longer, breathing through my teeth, eyes open wide enough that they ached, not blinking, afraid that if I closed them, I would hear it again, not because I didn't want to, but because I did, because it had said something I couldn't explain, a question I didn't know how to answer, and a statement that implied I had left before, or should have, or was never meant to be here. As long as I had been, I returned to my room without marking the way, without testing the loop, without checking the walls or counting the lights, and when I sat back on the bed, the logbook was already open to the next page, and I didn't remember doing that. The pen was beside it, full of ink again, and at the top of the page, written in a careful version of my handwriting, was the sentence, "It doesn't always ask out loud." I wrote beneath it slowly, deliberately, "What does it want?" And the pen in my hand began to leak, black ink spilling across the page, soaking through to the desk, and I dropped it and stepped back, watching as the words bled upward, curling into a shape I had seen before, on the walls of the supply closet, on the edge of the photograph of my sleeping face, a circle broken by a single line, like a loop intentionally undone. I tore the page out and burned it in the sink, not because I thought that would stop it, but because I needed something to end, even if it was just a piece of paper, even if it was just a lie I had told myself in writing. That night I heard the voice again, not from the hallway, not from behind the walls, but from inside the mirror above the desk, and I saw only my reflection when I looked, but I watched my own lips move a half second before the words reached my ears, and they said, "You're not the first one it liked." And I whispered back, "Who else?" And my reflection smiled and said, "You were supposed to forget her." It happened while I was rearranging the books in the records room, not because I needed to, not because they were out of order, but because I couldn't keep sitting still after what I'd seen in the mirror the night before, after hearing myself speak before my mouth moved, after the voice had answered questions I didn't know I'd asked. I needed movement, small action, distraction that required my hands and not my mind. So I began pulling the volumes off the shelves, cleaning them, checking them for annotations or missing pages, placing them back with measured precision, and I must have done this for hours because the lighting in the room began to shift, that soft sinking dimness that settles in just before the hum of the hallway changes pitch. And I remember standing with one of the binders in my arms when my knuckle brushed against something behind the shelf, something cold, not the metal backing I expected, not the smooth painted wall, but something textured, like brushed steel with a pattern etched into it. I froze, fingers resting against it, heart tapping once, twice, too slow, and then I stepped back, set the binder down, and stared at the wall behind the shelf, the space that wasn't supposed to exist, the gap that hadn't been there a second ago, or maybe had always been there, and I had never touched it, never leaned far enough, never paid attention in the right direction. I reached behind again, sliding my hand along the back panel of the shelf, and there it was. A small groove, a recessed line I could follow, a rectangle just barely wide enough to be a hatch door, just barely visible, just barely real. I pushed the shelf away from the wall slowly, quietly, as if afraid the building would hear me, as if the corridor would shift again to erase what I was discovering. The shelf scraped across the tile and revealed what had been hidden, an old hatch, about chest height, marked with no labels, no numbers, no markings of any kind, except for a small, almost ceremonial spiral etched into the center, not painted, but cut into the metal itself, the same spiral I had burned into a logbook page, the same spiral I had seen in the photo above my bed. I traced it with my finger and felt the same coldness I'd felt the moment I opened the drawer of reports I hadn't written, that same sensation of touching something not meant for the surface. There was no handle, only a latch, and beside it, wedged into a rusted seam, a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, like it had been left in the cold for decades. I slid it out gently, opened it, and read a single sentence, written in my own handwriting, a style slightly older than mine, less fluid, more angular, as if written in haste or pain. Don't open unless you remember everything. I stared at the words for so long that the lighting around me seemed to change, like my vision was tunneling, or the power had dipped again, or the hatch itself was adjusting to my attention. I read the sentence again and again, hoping the words would shift or vanish or reveal a second layer of meaning. But they didn't, and the implications settled over me like frost on a window. The hatch was not a destination. It was a test, a threshold I had reached before, or might reach again, and opening it prematurely could mean collapse, not of the base, but of what I believed about it, about myself, about the integrity of my memory. I left it closed for now, but I didn't move the shelf back. I wanted to see it every time I passed the records room. I wanted the spiral to remind me that forgetting wasn't an accident, that the structure I was in was designed not to contain, but to erase, not to imprison, but to observe, that I wasn't the subject of a system, but part of the system itself, that whatever had brought me here had done so repeatedly, recursively, and that the moment I opened that hatch, the loop would change form. That night I opened the envelope, the one I had found in the drawer during the first week, the one marked in my own writing, "Open last," the one I had carried in my pocket like a talisman or a threat, always aware of it, always pretending not to be inside, was a page from the logbook, one I hadn't written, but it was in my voice, and it described the discovery of a hatch behind the record shelf. It detailed the latch, the spiral, the note wedged beside it. It included a warning, not just "don't open unless you remember everything," but a second line that hadn't been in the physical note, something only present here, as if the letter had recorded what I hadn't seen. "If you open it too early, you will meet yourself halfway." That sentence undid me in a way nothing else had, because it confirmed what I had begun to suspect, that there was another version of me still walking these halls, maybe ahead, maybe behind, maybe already folded into the base's cycle in a layer I hadn't reached. And if the hatch was a bridge, a bleed between one iteration and the next, then opening it before I remembered all the past loops might mean collapse, not of the structure, but of the self. And suddenly I couldn't tell if the spiral was a door or a mirror. I hadn't used the camera again since the photos, hadn't touched it, hadn't moved the drawer it rested in. I told myself it was safer to leave it there, sealed and quiet and forgotten, that objects carried echoes and maybe it was better not to wake them twice. But something changed on the 24th morning, something small, something stupid. I knocked over the tin of powdered milk on the kitchen shelf, and the lid spun as it hit the ground, the noise sharp and hollow in the U. Quiet, but it didn't stop spinning, not right away. It just kept circling in place like a compass needle without magnetic north, and when it did stop, it pointed, not east, not west, not toward any wall or fixture, but toward the drawer in the operations room, and my stomach sank because I knew before I checked that the camera would be gone. The drawer was empty, no sign of damage, no scratch marks, no broken lock, just clean space where something should have been, And before I could even ask how or when or why, I felt it, the tightening of air pressure in the corridor behind me, the shift of temperature that comes when a new presence enters a room even if the door never opened. And I turned, not quickly, not with panic, but with the slow resignation of someone arriving too late to stop the moment that's already begun. The monitor on the far wall, the one connected to the interior surveillance feed, an old system I never bothered with because it hadn't powered on in weeks, was glowing, grainy, black and white static dancing across its surface like a fogged mirror. And then, frame by frame, it began to clarify, resolving into a hallway I recognized, the main corridor just outside the airlock, the one that leads to the eastern loop. And there, emerging from the edge of the frame, was a figure, walking slowly, wearing my boots, my coat, my posture, my face. I didn't speak, didn't blink, just watched as she entered the corridor like she belonged to it, like it had opened for her, like she knew where she was going, head tilted just slightly to the left the way I do and trying to listen beyond what's audible, hands tucked into pockets, stride even and confident. And when she passed directly in front of the camera and paused, just for a moment, her eyes looked directly into the lens and then into me. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't playback. The timestamp was live, and I was standing in the operations room watching a woman who was me walk into the base from the outside. There was no snow on her coat, no frost on her breath, no sound on the feet at all, just movement, purpose, and that unbearable familiarity that comes when you look at yourself and realize you're being studied, not mirrored. She walked out of frame after 23 seconds, and I counted every one. The feed cut back to static. I didn't go looking for her. I didn't grab a flashlight or call out or try to retrace her steps, because deep down I understood that if I found her too soon, if I confronted the loop directly, it might shatter something that couldn't be put back together, and I wasn't sure which of us would be the one to break. Instead, I returned to the hatch behind the bookshelf. I stood in front of it for a long time, note still folded in my hand, the spiral still etched into the steel like a scar that refused to heal, and I whispered out loud this time, not a question, but an offering. What do you want me to remember? And the voice answered, not in words, not from behind me, but from inside me. A sensation that bloomed behind my ribs and pressed upward through my throat like steam, rising from something that had been sealed too long. And in that moment, I saw it all. The first arrival, the first loop, the moment I touched the corridor and it rewrote itself around me. The days I had forgotten, the versions of myself who had written pages I never read, the warnings I had left for myself in places I no longer dared to check. I saw the moment I stood in the snow outside the airlock, watching a woman inside the base move from room to room with a fear I recognized, and I remembered the sound of my own voice whispering, "You're still here?" Not as question, but as memory. I had walked this place before I had opened the hatch. I had met her, me, halfway, and I had forgotten it all to survive, to be allowed back in, because that's how the structure works. It lets you return, but only if you surrender something in exchange. And I had chosen memory. That's why the logs skip. That's why the pages change. That's why the spiral opens only when you remember, because only the version of you who knows what she gave up is permitted to choose again. So I returned to the camera feed the next morning, not to search, but to wait. And she came again, this time through the North Hall, a little slower, a little more cautious, as if the weight of remembering was starting to settle over her too. And I realized then that the loop wasn't a circle, it was a spiral after all, and we weren't just walking in the same steps. We were approaching each other, layer by layer, version by version. And when we finally meet at the center, only one of us will be allowed to keep the name. I don't remember deciding to open the hatch, not in the way you remember choosing what to eat or where to walk or which drawer to search for batteries. It wasn't a decision, not exactly. It was more like a closing of space between the part of me that had been resisting and the part that had already surrendered. A gentle collapse of resistance under the weight of recognition. Because after watching her move through the corridors that were mine but not mine, after seeing her hands brush against the walls like they knew which panels would hum and which ones would answer, after hearing my voice ask questions I hadn't formed yet, I knew I couldn't wait any longer, that I couldn't live in the narrow space between forgetting and remembering, that the loop wouldn't let me circle forever. It wanted resolution, it demanded symmetry, and the hatch had. Been waiting long enough. I found the spiral warm to the touch. Not hot, not glowing, not burning, just warm, like something had recently leaned against it, pressed a forehead to it, whispered into its seam. I laid my hand flat against it, no gloves, no hesitation, and it slid open, not with force or resistance, but with a sound like breath being held and then released, a sigh made of metal and dust, and behind it was no ladder, no stairwell, no access shaft or tunnel, just a corridor, my corridor, endless empty, perfectly lit with those flickering bulbs I had long since memorized, walls the exact gray tone of institutional denial, floor scuffed with marks I recognized but had never made. It didn't descend or rise or angle. It simply stretched forward, a mirror that didn't reflect but invited, and I stepped in because that's what was always going to happen. I was always going to walk that corridor, because I already had, because I remembered the footsteps echoing behind me before I'd even taken them, because the spiral wasn't a lock or a barrier or a test. It was a threshold, and I was ready. The door sealed behind me with no sound at all, no click, no hiss, no confirmation, and I felt no need to look back, because back didn't exist anymore. Not the way it had. Not in this place where directions folded into choices and choices rewrote directions. The floor was soft under my boots, not spongy, not yielding, just not firm in the way reality normally is. And I realized that the corridor wasn't designed to hold a body. It was designed to hold a memory, or maybe the absence of one, and that I was no longer walking forward but inward, toward the center of something that had always been moving toward me too. Time bled in ways I no longer questioned. I saw echoes of myself ahead and behind, flickers of motion caught in the periphery that looked like shoulder turns I hadn't made yet, that felt like thoughts I hadn't formed but had already spoken. I saw shadows in the wall, panels, figures standing perfectly still in rooms that no longer existed, glimpses of a woman standing at a console, writing into a logbook with a shaking hand, crying over a drawer full of her own handwriting, burning pages in a sink and watching the smoke spiral upward into a vent that whispered her name back to her. And I remembered her, all of her, every version, every loop, every choice to forget, to remain, to open, to wait. They weren't all me, but they had all been me, and now they were gone. Not erased, just spent like breaths, used up in the effort of remembering. And I knew that the spiral wasn't a symbol of containment. It was a clock, and the corridor was its pendulum. And I had reached the moment where it stopped swinging, where it turned inward, and asked, not with cruelty or malice, but with inevitability, "Will you be the one who stays?" And I answered the only way I could. I kept walking. No more counting lights. No more watching the floor tiles repeat like forgotten promises. No more testing the loop or marking the walls or searching for cameras or reflections or sounds that didn't belong to the building, because I understood now that the structure didn't malfunction. It didn't distort. It reflected, it recreated, it responded to the pressure of presence, and I had filled it with mine, so it gave me what I asked for. A place to stay, a place to dissolve, a place where I didn't have to be remembered because I had become the memory. I don't know how long I walked. I don't know if I stopped. I don't know if the woman who wore my face found the hatch or watched me vanish into it, or became me as I became her, or simply continued her loop in a different layer of the spiral, because there is no ending here, no final door, no resolution, only the corridor, only the spiral, only the version of me that chose to remember, and the echo of the voice that once asked if I was still here. I am. I always was, and now I always will be. I stood on their porch with my suitcase in one hand and a folded black coat in the other, the kind of coat reserved for church and burials. Though after the day I'd had, I no longer knew if those were two different things. The sun had already dipped beneath the hill behind the maple trees, casting the street in a blue half-light that made everything look older and colder than it had a few hours earlier when we lowered Margaret into the ground. I'd watched the dirt pile rise on one side of her grave and tried not to think about the cold seeping through that thin mahogany box, tried not to imagine the sound of it closing over her, tried not to reach for a hand that wasn't there anymore. And when it was done, when the last shovel of earth had fallen and the people with warm coats and soft voices had walked away, I stood alone beside a stone, with her name not yet etched, and realized I had nowhere left to go. Emily hadn't stayed long after the burial. She hugged me, brief and cold, the kind of hug that says obligation more than affection, and said she had to get back before the boys' bedtime. The boys. I hadn't seen them since Christmas, and even then, only for an hour between dessert and bedtime stories. She said they'd be tired. She said the drive would be long. She didn't ask where I would spend the night. She didn't offer. So I stood there in that cemetery longer than I should have, breathing in a world without Margaret in it, then picked up my bag and walked. I knew the bus route well enough, knew which stop left me 2 blocks from their subdivision, knew that even if she hadn't meant it, she'd let me in once she saw me standing there. She was my daughter, after all. The porch light flicked on as I stepped up. It wasn't motion activated. That meant someone had seen me coming. I adjusted my coat, combed back what little hair I had left with my fingers, and knocked. The door opened too fast, like he'd been standing just on the other side. Greg, my son-in-law, 39, tall, thin, and dressed like he worked in some office where nobody spoke above a whisper. He looked at me like a package he hadn't ordered, and before I could say anything, he said, "Hey, Frank, everything all right?" That's what he said, like I might have stopped by to borrow sugar after my wife's funeral. I cleared my throat. "I was hoping I could stay the night," I said, voice low but steady, because I'd already lost enough pride that day and didn't have much left to bargain with. He blinked, glanced behind him into the house like I might bring cold air with me, and smiled. Not kindly, the kind of smile that comes when you're uncomfortable and trying to hide it. It's kind of a tight week. We've got the kids in their routines, and I've got early calls in the morning." I waited. He added, "This isn't exactly a nursing home." He laughed, a short, stupid laugh, and I just stood there, holding that bag, watching him chuckle like I was the punchline to a joke he didn't even understand. "I wouldn't be any trouble," I said after a beat, "just for the night." He scratched the back of his neck. "It's just, you know how it is. The boys need their sleep, and Emily's been stretched thin. You know how hard this has been on her." Yes, I thought, I know exactly how hard it's been. I watched her walk away from her mother's grave without tears, without a backward glance, without even a flower left behind. "I understand," I said, though I didn't. He nodded like that settled it. I turned slowly, walked back down the steps, the bag heavier now, the air colder. Behind me, the door shut, not slammed, just quietly, politely, with the soft finality of a guest being told it was time to leave. I stood in the driveway for a moment, unsure of where to go, unsure of what I was to anyone anymore. I thought of calling someone, an old neighbor maybe, but the numbers felt too far away, and my voice too small to ask again. So I walked, past the quiet houses with their warm windows and television glow, past the mailbox that still had their last name painted in black on the side, even though Greg had joked about changing it. I walked until the streetlights ended, until the sidewalk gave way to gravel, until I reached the edge of the old trail that led down to where the town thinned into trees. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stand outside their house like a man asking to be remembered. I sat on a bench by the creek as night fully took the sky. The wind pressed hard against my coat, and the sounds of the world grew quiet, save for the water and the occasional hum of a distant car. I reached into my coat and pulled out the last photograph we took together, Margaret and me, sitting on the back porch of the house we built with our hands, a pie cooling beside us, the sun setting behind her hair. I traced her outline with my thumb, remembering how warm her hands were even in the final weeks, how she still smiled when she said my name. And then I remembered something worse, that the house wasn't mine anymore, that even if I walked all night to get there, even if I opened that old white gate and stepped onto the porch we painted together, I wouldn't find her. I wouldn't find her things. I wouldn't find the smell of her perfume or the sound of her slippers on the kitchen tile. The house was someone else's now, not by time or age or sale, but by something deeper, something crueler. I looked up at the sky, whispered her name, and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I told myself, tomorrow I'd go back. Tomorrow I'd find out why the locks had changed on the place where my life used to live. I walked the road to the edge of town the next morning, the sun barely up and the clouds sitting low like they'd been nailed to the tops of the trees. My feet ached by the time I reached the fence, but I didn't stop. I hadn't slept. Not really. I'd closed my eyes for a few minutes on a bench behind the church, pulled my coat tighter against the cold, and let the sounds of morning settle around me like I was already halfway into the ground myself. But the house had started calling me even before that, quietly at first, like a memory I couldn't shake, then louder, like a voice I hadn't heard in too long. Margaret was gone. That part I understood. But the house, our house, still stood, and something inside me needed to see it again, needed to know that some part of her hadn't vanished along with the rest. I followed the gravel road past the old Miller place, past the oak tree with the rusted horseshoe still nailed to the bark, and down the hill where the road turns to dust. And there it was. The house, ours, or at least it had been. 43 years we lived there. through winter floods and dry summers and every year of Emily's life until the day she left for college. Margaret had chosen the color of the shutters, dark green like the ones on her grandmother's cottage, and I'd built the porch myself with cedar boards that smelled like sunlight for years. The roof had been redone twice, the well pump replaced, the screen door fixed more times than I could count. It was a home made by hand, and every inch of it still carried the weight of her touch, or so I thought. When I reached the gate, I paused. The latch was different, new, shiny, not rusted like the one I'd greased every spring. I pushed it open and stepped into the yard. The grass was trimmed, the rose bushes pruned, the swing beneath the sycamore gone. I moved up the steps slowly, one hand on the rail, and knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. So I tried the knob. It was unlocked. I stepped inside, and the breath went out of me like someone had punched my chest. Nothing was there. Not just in the sense of furniture or objects, but her. The scent of cinnamon that used to hang in the kitchen after her pies cooled, the faint trace of lavender she kept in the linen drawers, the warm creak of the floor near the stove where she always stood barefoot in the early mornings. All gone. The living room was bare. The couch where we fell asleep watching old westerns, gone. The photos that had lined the mantel above the fireplace, missing. The wedding picture that always hung in the hallway, vanished. I walked through each room like a man in a museum of someone else's life. The walls had been repainted, the kitchen tiles replaced, the curtains she sewed by hand no longer in the windows. Even the coffee mugs were different, cold, soulless, clean in a way that meant they didn't belong to anyone yet. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom. The door was open. The bed wasn't ours. The headboard was too tall, too dark. The sheets pale blue, not cream. The rug beneath the window, the one we bought after that trip to Asheville, gone. I opened the closet, empty. No trace of her cardigans, her scarves, the lavender coat she loved even though it was 2 sizes too big. I looked for her jewelry box, the one her mother gave her, but the dresser top was bare. I checked the drawers. Nothing. No letters, no notes, no handwriting, no scent. I walked to the guest room. The same. Bare. The old desk where she kept her journals, gone. The shelf where she placed all the little angels people gave her, missing. I opened the hall closet, empty. I felt something sink in me, something heavy and quiet and final. Downstairs again, I found the envelope on the fireplace. It was resting on the stone like it had been waiting. A thick manila envelope with no markings except for a label in the corner, transfer of title. My name was typed on the first page, but not as the recipient, as the previous owner. The new name wasn't one I recognized, not Emily, not Greg, not even a relative, just a name I'd never seen before, and a date, 3 weeks before Margaret died. I sat on the floor right there in the middle of that empty house and held the envelope in my lap. The papers slid out easily, copies of deeds and approvals and signatures, one of them mine, or at least it looked like mine. A smooth electronic scrawl on a dotted line beneath the words, "Final Consent." I stared at it until the edges of the page blurred. I had never signed anything. I hadn't used a computer in years. Margaret had taken care of our bills after my hands began to shake. She would print everything out. We kept a folder. We read every line. We did things the slow way. But this wasn't slow. This was fast, slick, stolen. And somewhere in the empty echo of our kitchen, I heard her voice say my name. Not loud, not real, but enough to make me rise. I opened the back door and stepped into the yard. The garden was still there, the soil freshly turned, but her tulips were gone, the bird bath missing, the bench replaced. And I knew then, this wasn't just about things. Someone had tried to erase her, not just her presence, but her history, her imprint, her memory, and with it, mine. I stood there for a long time, staring at nothing. Then I turned and walked out the front door, leaving it open behind me. The house no longer belonged to me, but I wasn't finished. Something had been taken, and I would find out who signed my name, and why they thought I wouldn't come back to check. The walk to the bank was longer than I remembered, not just because my legs aren't what they used to be, but because I felt the weight of something heavier than distance dragging behind me with every step. The morning was crisp and sharp, the kind of air that used to make Margaret laugh when it turned her cheeks red, and I kept catching myself looking for her beside me like she'd always been there. But the sidewalk was empty, and so was the house we'd built together, and now the papers I held in my coat pocket, those cold copies of something I never touched, were the only proof I had that the world had turned without me knowing. I didn't understand how someone could take your name, your home, and your history, and fold it all into a handful of pages like you were already gone. But someone had done it. Someone had forged my signature, sold my house, and thrown Margaret's life into a pile of nothing. And I was going to find out who. The bank sat at the edge of the main square, a modest brick building with double glass doors and a brass handle that had dulled from decades of hands like mine. I pushed inside, the bell overhead chiming once, and was greeted by the familiar scent of carpet cleaner and quiet tension, the kind of place where people speak in low voices even when they aren't doing anything wrong. A woman behind the counter looked up, recognized me, or at least my kind, and gave me a small nod. I walked to the reception desk, cleared my throat, and said I needed to speak with someone about a property transfer. The receptionist blinked behind thick glasses, tapped a few keys, and asked if I had an appointment. I said no. She asked for my name. I gave it. Her fingers froze for a second too long. "Mr. Cole," she said, "please take a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." I did as told, sitting on a chair that made my hip ache, folding my coat over my knees. I stared at the fake plant in the corner and tried to remember when exactly I stopped being someone people called sir and started being someone they asked to wait. After 10 minutes, a man in a gray suit appeared from the back. He was young, too young to wear a watch that expensive. He smiled like it was his job to smile, and led me into an office lined with books he'd never read. "Mr. Cole," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Daniel. I understand you have some questions about your recent transaction." I shook his hand, but not warmly. "There was no transaction," I said. He paused, adjusted his tie. "I have here on record a completed title transfer for your former residence. The property was signed over to a holding company and then purchased by a private buyer last week, all fully compliant with state regulations." I pulled the envelope from my coat and laid the papers flat on his desk. "Then explain that," I said. He skimmed the top page, nodded. "Yes, that's a copy of the official deed transfer. And here," he flipped through the packet, "is your signature." "That's not my signature." He stopped. "I never signed that," I said. "Not in person, not online. I don't even own a computer. I don't have an email address. I still pay my bills with checks." He looked at me now, not surprised, just cautious, like I was a problem he hadn't expected to walk through the door. "Well," he said, "this appears to be an electronic signature filed through our DocuTrack system. It's secure, state-approved, and used by many of our clients for remote transactions." "I'm not a client," I said. "I never authorized anything like this." He leaned back. "Do you have power of attorney with anyone on file?" "No." "Do you recall giving verbal or written consent for someone to act on your behalf?" "No." He tapped the desk. "There's a record here of a confirmation call." "With who?" He clicked through a few windows on his screen. "It says Emily Cole." My throat tightened. "That's my daughter." He nodded. "She verified your intent, gave authorization to send the documents to your residence." "What address?" He read it aloud. "It wasn't mine. It was hers. She said she was caring for you," he added, "that you had limited mobility and difficulty reading paperwork. The system logged a vocal signature with a matching date and IP address." I didn't say anything. "I understand," he said, raising his hand slightly, "but the system verifies voice print as consent." "My wife was still alive then," I said. "She handled everything, and she never would have allowed this." His face changed slightly, not enough to call it guilt, just a small flicker of discomfort. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "I want the documents annulled," I said. "Reversed, investigated." He shifted in his chair. "That would require a legal dispute," he said. "You'd need to hire a lawyer, file a claim for fraud, prove incapacity or coercion. And even then, are you telling me I lost my house because someone clicked a button?" He didn't answer. "I buried my wife 3 days ago," I said. I held her hand as she stopped breathing in the room she painted yellow with her own hands. "And now you're saying some stranger with a keyboard gets to erase that?" "No one's erasing anything," he said, but even he didn't believe it. "Then give me the name of the buyer." "I'm afraid I can't do that." "I'll find it." He stood. "Mr. Cole, I really am sorry for the confusion, but as far as the bank is concerned, the transfer is complete and legally binding." I stood too, and I stared at him longer than he was comfortable with. "Then tell me this," I said. "If I didn't sign it, and my wife didn't sign it, then who exactly did you shake hands with when you took our life from us?" He didn't answer. I left, not because I was done, but because I had somewhere else to go. I remember the funeral less as an event and more as a sequence of moments that refused to connect, like a string of photographs taken in different decades, none of them sharp, none of them whole, just fragments. I remember the flowers arriving late and the way the funeral home smelled too clean, like antiseptic and pine, A lie told to your nose to keep you from remembering what death really is. I remember the priest mispronouncing her middle name and me not having the energy to correct him. I remember the hands on my shoulder, warm, cold, sincere, hollow, but I don't remember the words that followed. What I do remember, with more clarity than anything else, is the way my daughter stood 2 rows back, eyes dry, mouth pressed thin, looking not at the coffin, not at me, but at the door, as if she was already on her way out. Margaret had always said Emily was complicated. Not difficult, not cruel, just complicated. A girl with too many thoughts and not enough space to put them. She was a quiet child, studious, polite. She didn't cry when she scraped her knees. She didn't laugh too loud. She kept her room clean, her answers short, and her feelings folded into corners we weren't always allowed to reach. I told myself she'd grow out of it, that she'd find softness later, that love would untangle whatever knots the world had put in her. But as I sat in the front pew of that chapel and watched her hug strangers with more warmth than she'd shown her mother's memory, I began to feel a crack forming in something I thought was unbreakable. When the service ended, she approached me with her husband in tow, his hand on her back like he was guiding her towards something she didn't want to touch. She leaned down to hug me, her arms loose around my shoulders, and whispered she would have wanted peace. Then she pulled back before I could respond, already turning to check on the boys, already walking away. I watched her from a distance as she laughed at something one of them said. Not a cruel laugh, not loud, just light, detached. And then she turned and caught me watching her, and for half a second, no more, she smiled. Not a warm smile, not a sad smile, a polite smile, the kind you give someone who's overstayed their welcome. That smile stayed with me. It haunted the hours after I left their porch, after Greg told me their house wasn't a nursing home and Emily didn't come to the door at all. I lay awake on that bench behind the church, thinking about it. Not the smile itself, but what it meant. What kind of daughter smiles at her father like that after burying her mother? What kind of daughter doesn't offer him a bed, a blanket, a place to land? What kind of person signs his name on papers that steal his home? I kept asking myself these questions, and each time I came back to the same answer. I didn't know my daughter anymore, or maybe I never had. The next day, I sat in the park across from their subdivision, watching the kids walk to school. I wasn't stalking. I wasn't lost. I just needed to see her one more time, to look at her face and see if any part of Margaret was still alive in it. At 7:45, the front door opened. Emily stepped out with her youngest in one hand, and the older boy trailing behind with a backpack too big for his shoulders. Greg came out next, coffee in hand, sunglasses on, kissed her cheek. She laughed at something he said. They looked like a family, a real one, a whole one. Except I wasn't part of it. I thought about the nights we used to sit at the kitchen table, Margaret and I, waiting for Emily to come home from dates or parties or school plays, and how often she'd come in late, brushing off our questions, offering excuses, never quite present. Margaret always covered for her, always said she was just tired, just stressed, just growing. But I wonder now if she knew, if she saw at first, that Emily had already begun to step away from us, long before we were ready to let her go. After they left, I walked past the house, not close, just far enough to see that the porch had been painted gray. Margaret loved the old white, said it reminded her of porches in movies where people drank lemonade and watched the world slow down. Now it was gray, sterile. The wind chimes were gone. The fern she used to water every morning missing. Even the mailbox had been replaced. No longer the coals, just numbers. That night, I opened the old shoebox I'd been carrying in the bottom of my suitcase. It held the letters Margaret wrote me during my first deployment, tied with twine, yellowed with time but still smelling faintly of cedar. I read them all again, every one. And in the last one, the one she wrote the night before I came home for good, she said something I hadn't remembered until now. She said, "If Emily ever turns her back on you, don't take it personal. She just doesn't know how to carry things." I didn't understand it then. I thought she was being poetic or vague or just tired. But now I think she knew what her daughter was and wasn't capable of, knew the kind of strength that takes more than blood to earn, knew that some people only show up for love when it's easy, when it doesn't cost them anything. But I also think Margaret hoped that Emily would grow, that she'd change, that she'd remember. But people don't always grow the way you hope. Sometimes they harden. That smile at the funeral, that was the last time she looked at me like I still mattered. Now all I have is a stack of forged papers, a house full of strangers, and a question I can't stop asking myself. When exactly did my daughter start planning a life where I wasn't part of it? I hadn't planned on going back to their house. Not after how Greg spoke to me that night on the porch. Not after Emily refused to come to the door. Not after everything I'd seen and everything I'd been forced to feel since Margaret passed. But it had been 2 weeks since the funeral, and the silence inside me was starting to rot, turning not just into grief but into questions that refused to let me sleep. And it wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about the way Margaret's name had vanished from their mouths, about the way her memory had been packed into nothing, about the way even the boys didn't ask where she'd gone or what she'd meant. But most of all, it was about the sound of my grandson's voice on the phone that morning, soft and trembling, whispering something that changed the weight of the entire world. He'd called from their landline, said he found the number in the old address book his mother kept in the drawer she never let him open, said his mom and dad were out, said he had something to tell me. I almost didn't answer, but when I picked up and heard his small voice, I knew it wasn't just a child's curiosity. It was fear, and in his fear, I heard Margaret, not her voice, her instinct. He said, "Grandpa, Grandma lives in the basement now." I didn't speak at first, just listened to his breath on the other end. He continued, "I see her sometimes when I go down to get the laundry. She doesn't look the same, but I know it's her. She told me to tell you something, but I had to wait until they were gone." I asked him what she said. He paused, then he whispered, "She says she's not resting. She says she was taken. I don't remember hanging up. I don't remember grabbing my coat. I don't remember walking to the edge of town or hitching a ride from a farmer who remembered me from church. All I remember is standing in front of that gray-painted house, knowing I'd never be welcome and not caring. Because if my grandson was hearing Margaret's voice from the basement of a house where she'd been erased, then I had no choice but to find out what had been buried beneath all that silence. When I knocked, it wasn't Emily who answered. It was Peter, the younger one, 7, maybe 8 now. He looked up at me with wide eyes and stepped back without a word. I entered quietly, closed the door behind me, and waited to hear footsteps. But the house was silent. No adult voices, no television, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the floor beneath my boots. "Are they home?" I asked. He shook his head. "They went to the store. Mom forgot bread again." I looked around. The furniture was the same as the last time. Sterile, impersonal, nothing that belonged to a life lived. But the family photos had returned, only they were different. Cropped, Margaret missing, me missing, just Emily, Greg, and the boys, frozen in scenes that had been cleaned of history, like we'd never existed. "Can I see the basement?" I asked gently. Peter nodded slowly, then led me through the hallway past the kitchen to a narrow wooden door at the far end. It had a bolt on the outside, a lock, not a child-proof latch, a real lock. "She talks to me here," he whispered. "When?" I asked. "At night. Does your mom know?" He shook his head quickly. "She'd get mad." "Does she go down there?" "No," he said. "She said it's just for storage, but I hear things sometimes, scratches, and I think I saw a light once under the door." I bent down, looked into his face. "What else did Grandma say?" He hesitated, then said, "She said she tried to protect you, but someone made her choose." I stood. The doorknob was cold. I turned it slowly. It opened without resistance. The stairs were steep and narrow, the kind built before anyone cared about safety or code, and the light bulb overhead flickered as I stepped down. The air changed instantly, heavier, mustier, but not entirely unpleasant. Not the scent of mold or decay, but something older. Dust, paper, time. I reached the bottom and turned on the light. What I saw didn't make sense. The basement was empty, mostly. A few boxes, a chair, a table, but no furniture, no clutter, no sign that anyone had used the space in years, except for one thing. On the far wall, written in chalk, were the words, "I remember." Not large, not dramatic, just neat, careful block letters, a child's hand, and beside them, a small drawing, a woman, smiling, holding the hand of a boy. I turned to Peter. "Did you draw that?" He shook his head. "I found it like that. I just visit her." "Here?" He pointed to the far wall behind the boxes. I moved them aside. There was a vent, old, rusted, large enough for a child's voice to travel. I knelt beside it. "Margaret," I whispered. Nothing. I waited. Then, faint, too soft for the boy to hear, but real, I heard it. My name. Not loud, not broken, just my name, spoken with the patience of someone who's been waiting for a long time in a very dark place. I stood quickly and turned back to Peter. "You mustn't come down here anymore," I said. "But, promise me." He nodded slowly. I led him back upstairs, heart pounding. When we reached the living room, Emily was standing by the door, her arms crossed, eyes cold. "Dad," she said flatly. I didn't explain. She didn't ask. Greg stepped in behind her. "Can we help you with something?" he asked. I looked at them both, then down at Peter, who stood silent by the stairs. "No," I said. "I just wanted to say goodbye." And I meant it, because the next time I came back, it wouldn't be to knock. It would be to open every door they'd tried to keep shut. I hadn't spoken to Robert Kramer in nearly 12 years, not since the day he retired from practice and sent out those embossed cards thanking everyone for their years of trust and companionship. He and Margaret used to joke that he looked more like a barber than a lawyer, the way his silver hair was always combed back like a man trying to stay 30 years old forever. He'd handled our wills, our mortgage, our disputes with the county over that fence line that kept shifting every time it rained. Margaret trusted him, even when I didn't. He had a habit of smiling too much when he said things that should have been serious, but he'd always been honest, as far as I knew, and that counted for something. That's why, after I heard my grandson's whisper about Margaret not resting, and after I saw the words in chalk on that basement wall, I called him, or rather, I went to see him. I needed to know if there had ever been something Margaret wanted to say that I was never meant to hear. His house was smaller than I remembered. Clean porch, sun-faded shutters, the same wind chimes we once gave him for Christmas swinging over the mailbox. I knocked and waited. When the door opened, his eyes widened like he was seeing a ghost, and in a way, maybe he was. "Frank," he said, and for once, he didn't smile. "Come in." I followed him through the narrow hallway, past the ticking grandfather clock, into his study. It smelled like old paper and lemon polish. He gestured to the armchair across from his, and we sat in silence for a moment before he cleared his throat. "I heard about Margaret," he said. I nodded. "Thank you." He looked down at his hands. "She was a good woman, always sharper than me. She was better than most," I said. He sighed, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling like he was debating something. "You didn't come here just for condolences." "No," I said. "I figured." I reached into my coat and pulled out the copy of the property transfer, slid it across the desk. "Do you recognize this?" I asked. He adjusted his glasses, skimmed the top page, and nodded slowly. "Yes, I've seen this version." "Version?" He looked at me carefully. "There was an earlier draft, one that never went through, one that had both your names on it, equal beneficiaries. Where is it?" "Gone," he said. "Gone where?" "I don't know," he replied. "It was pulled from our files shortly after Margaret's final meeting. She came alone. She was frail, but clear. She asked me to draft an amended will and update your property rights. But before I could file it, before signatures, before it became official, it was withdrawn." "By who?" He hesitated, looked down again. "Emily." My stomach twisted. "She came into my office the week Margaret passed. Said the old documents weren't valid. Said new arrangements were being made. Did she have authority?" Robert frowned. "She claimed to. Showed me a power of attorney signed by Margaret, dated just 2 days before her death. That's not possible." "I agree." I leaned forward, heart pounding. "Why didn't you tell me?" He swallowed hard. "Because I was told not to." "By who?" He shook his head. "Frank, there's something you weren't supposed to see." He stood, crossed the room, opened a small safe hidden behind a painting. From it, he pulled a thin folder. He handed it to me without speaking. Inside were 3 sheets. The first was a copy of Margaret's final instructions, unsigned. The second was a list of assets titled, "For Franklin." The third was a letter, in Margaret's handwriting. "Frank, if you're reading this, it means something didn't go as planned. I never meant to hide anything from you. I only wanted to protect you. Emily is not who you think she is. She hasn't been for a long time. I tried to leave everything in your name, but I was pressured, threatened. I can't explain it all now, and I know this sounds strange, but please trust your instincts. The house, the will, the past, it's all been rewritten. You have to find the truth yourself. I believe in you. I love you. Always." "Ma'am," my hands trembled. "She wrote this?" I asked. Robert nodded. "But she never gave it to you. Emily intercepted it." "How?" "She came to my house, said Margaret was confused, that I wasn't to worry about the documents anymore. And you listened." "I was tired," he said, his voice cracking. "I believed her. She was your daughter." I looked down at the letter again. It felt like betrayal and forgiveness all at once. "She says, I have to find the truth myself." Robert nodded slowly. "There's more than you realize, Frank." "I'm starting to believe that." As I stood to leave, he grabbed my arm. "Be careful," he said. "If Margaret was scared, you should be too." Outside, the sky had darkened. The wind picked up, and in the distance, somewhere deep in my memory, I heard Margaret's voice again. Not calling, warning. I didn't plan on confronting her that day. Not the way it happened. I told myself I'd be calm, measured. that I'd approach it like a man carrying truth instead of rage. But the moment I saw her face, my daughter's face, the one that used to light up when I picked her up from piano lessons or carried her on my shoulders down Main Street during the Harvest Parade, it was like someone took a match to the paper-thin wall holding my grief in place. I'd spent the morning staring at Margaret's letter, reading it until the ink became part of my memory, until her handwriting felt like breath, until the words stopped meaning what they said and began meaning something else entirely. Emily is not who you think she is. And when I walked up their driveway again, this time not with a bag in hand but with that letter folded inside my chest like a second spine, I knew something had broken between us long before the funeral, long before the house was taken, long before Margaret wrote those final words in ink that shook. She was out front when I arrived, kneeling by the rose bushes she'd never cared about when she was younger. Her hands were in the soil like they belonged there, like she'd always been someone who loved roots and growth and the smell of dirt. She didn't look up when I stepped off the curb and onto the path. She just said, without turning, "You're not supposed to be here." That was her greeting. No, "Hi, Dad." No, "How are you holding up?" No, "I'm sorry." Just an instruction. I walked to the edge of the garden and stopped. "I need to talk to you," I said. She wiped her hands on a towel, finally looking up. Her eyes didn't flicker, not even a tremor of surprise. She rose slowly, brushed off her knees, and folded her arms across her chest. "If this is about the house," she said, "you should take it up with Greg." "I'm not here about the house," I lied. "Then what?" I reached into my coat and pulled out the folded letter. She saw it and her face changed. Subtle, but I knew her too well not to notice. "What's that?" "You know what it is." She didn't answer. "She wrote it before she died," I said. "She left it with Robert." "She was confused," Emily said quickly, too quickly. "She was medicated. She didn't know what she was doing." "She knew exactly what she was doing." Emily stepped back slightly, then recovered. "That letter was never meant for you." "I know." She wasn't thinking clearly. She thought clearly enough to warn me. Silence stretched between us like a drawstring pulled too tight. Somewhere inside the house I heard the sound of footsteps, a door closing. Probably Greg, hiding. "Why?" I asked finally. "Why would you do that to her?" "To me?" She narrowed her eyes. "Don't pretend like you were some saint," she snapped. "You think I don't remember? The yelling? The night she cried herself to sleep? You were cold, Dad. You were always cold." I blinked. It wasn't what I expected. "That's not true. You think just because you stuck around that made you a hero? You think just because you didn't hit her or leave her that means you deserve everything she built? She gave everything to you and got nothing back. She was my wife. She was my mother. And you erased her." She flinched. "Just a fraction, but enough. You sold the house," I said. "You forged my name. You burned her belongings. You locked up a basement that doesn't belong to you. You told my grandson to lie to me." Her voice dropped low. "I protected my family." "From what?" "From your version of it." The anger that burned inside me didn't roar. It didn't shout. It went quiet, cold, the kind that doesn't flash. It lingers. "I gave you everything I had," I said. "Your mother gave you more than that." "She gave me guilt," Emily hissed. "Guilt and pressure and eyes that never looked at me with love unless you told her to. You don't know what it was like. You think we were this perfect little family." But I watched her fade. I watched her shrink into a woman who apologized for existing. And you stood there and did nothing. I stepped forward. I held her hand the day she died. She begged me not to tell you she was sick. She wrote me a letter. "Too late." "Maybe," I said. "But it's still more than you gave." She looked away then, toward the house, toward the windows. I could see the shape of Greg watching from behind the curtain. "Coward. You're not welcome here," she said softly. "I know. You can keep your letter." "I intend to." She shook her head. "You don't belong in this story anymore, Dad. This isn't yours." I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time I saw a woman I didn't recognize. Not my daughter, not my blood, just a stranger wearing her face. "You forgot," I said, "that I'm still your father." Her jaw clenched, but she said nothing. I turned and walked away, the letter burning in my pocket, her silence louder than any scream. And as I reached the sidewalk, I glanced back one last time. She was still there, arms crossed, eyes dry, unmoved, but I swear I saw something shift behind her, the shadow in the window. Not Greg, smaller, watching, waiting. And as I turned the corner, I whispered to myself something Margaret once told me when Emily was still a child who refused to say, "I love you," even when we said it first. Some people mistake silence for strength, but silence is just another kind of wound. Emily wasn't strong. She was wounded, but the wound she made in me, I would not let it bleed quietly anymore. I hadn't touched the garden behind the old house in years, not since Margaret's back gave out the spring before her diagnosis, and I told her I'd handle the weeds and the watering and the kneeling, but she still went out there every morning when she thought I wasn't looking, crouched over those rose bushes like she was tending not just to flowers, but to time itself. There was one bush in particular she loved most, a white rose she called Helena, for reasons I never understood, and she spoke to it like a friend, humming softly while trimming its edges, whispering small stories into its leaves like they could carry her words to the next life. After her death and after Emily took everything else, that garden had stayed in my mind like an unfinished conversation, the only place I hadn't searched, the only part of our home that might still carry a piece of her untouched by signatures and silence. And when I found myself standing at the fence line again, palms sweating and heart clenching like a fist inside my chest, I knew that if Margaret had hidden anything that mattered, anything that might still be mine, it would be there, in the dirt where her hands had last made meaning. It was late. The sky was deep purple, stars barely showing through a veil of cloud. I'd parked 3 blocks away and walked the rest under the cover of darkness, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want to be interrupted. I needed time. I needed silence that wasn't Emily's brand of cold dismissal, but something sacred, something soft enough to remember what love once felt like. The backyard hadn't changed much. The grass was longer than I remembered, and someone had moved the bird bath, but the roses were still there, and so was Helena. I knelt in front of it, ignoring the ache in my knees, the way my bones cracked when I shifted my weight. I let my fingers trace the outline of the soil, soft and damp and smelling of old roots. I dug carefully, the way Margaret used to, not with force, but with reverence. It didn't take long. Beneath the first layer of earth, wrapped in a plastic bag and tied with twine, was a thick hardcover Bible, not one of those store-bought display editions with gilded pages and untouched spines. This one was worn, the leather cracked, the edges bent. Margaret's Bible. I'd last seen it on our bedside table, the one she refused to let Emily pack away. I pulled it from the dirt like unearthing something holy, brushed off the mud, and opened it slowly. The pages still smelled faintly of lilac and thyme. Inside the front cover, beneath her name, written in ink that had faded to sepia, was a small envelope. No markings, no address, just my name, Franklin, in Margaret's handwriting. I held it in my lap for a long while before I opened it. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the pulse in my throat as if my body already knew what I was about to find. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. One, folded carefully, was the original will, ours, signed and notarized and dated 6 months before her health failed. It left everything to me: the house, the savings, her jewelry, even her grandmother's quilt. The second sheet was a letter. Frank, if you're reading this, then you've already seen what they've done. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want Emily to be like this, but I saw it coming. I saw the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, the way she spoke to Greg behind closed doors, the way she stopped asking questions and started making decisions on her own. I knew she was preparing something. I just didn't know what, or when, or how far it would go. So I wrote this, and I asked Robert to keep the rest. I buried this here with Helena because I knew you'd come looking not for answers, but for me. This is where I've always been, with you, even now. If she's taken the house, if she's taken my name off the walls, then you must fight for it. Not for the bricks or the land or the things, but for what we built, for us, for what we were. Don't let her bury you while you're still alive. I love you. I didn't cry. I thought I might. I thought the moment would break me, but it didn't. It stitched something back together, something Emily had tried to cut out. I folded the will carefully, placed it back in the envelope, tucked it inside my coat. I held the Bible for a moment longer, then stood. My knees groaned in protest, but I ignored them. I looked up at the sky and whispered her name, the way she used to whisper mine in the dark before sleep took us. Then I heard it, a sound from the house, a creak, a light flickering on, a shape in the upstairs window. It wasn't Emily. It wasn't Greg. It was smaller, still, watching. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I turned and walked back toward the street, Bible in one hand, will in the other, and as I stepped through the gate, I heard the wind move through the roses like a voice, soft and certain. You found it. I didn't stop. I had things to do, papers to file, a name to reclaim, and a daughter to remind that her father was not done yet. I mailed the letter before sunrise, standing in front of the old red mailbox outside the courthouse, the kind whose paint had peeled so many times you could see 3 generations of color beneath the surface. My fingers were stiff from the cold, the metal slick with dew, and as I slid the envelope through the slot, I felt something shift in me, like I'd placed the final stone in a grave that never should have been dug. The original will, Margaret's letter, my own affidavit written in pen that shook as much as my breath, all sealed in a thick manila envelope addressed to the registrar's office 3 blocks away. I could have handed it in person, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to see their faces, not yet. I wanted the truth to arrive on its own, unannounced and undeniable, like all good ghosts do. After that, I walked to the diner 2 streets down, the one Margaret and I used to visit on Sunday mornings when we were still figuring out how to be parents, then grandparents, then just 2 people who loved each other and were waiting for something to give them back the time they'd already given away. I sat in the same booth, ordered the same black coffee, didn't touch the toast. I didn't need to. I just wanted to be somewhere her voice still echoed in the walls, in the clink of ceramic on tile, in the way the waitress refilled my cup without asking because she remembered us as a pair, not 2 ghosts with only one left behind. It started around 9:30. The first call came while I was paying the bill. Unknown number. I let it ring. The second came before I'd even stepped out onto the sidewalk. Emily. I turned the phone over in my pocket. Didn't answer. By the time I reached the corner of Elm and Bradley, I had 5 missed calls. 2 from her, 2 from Greg. 1 from a number I didn't recognize, but which I knew by instinct belonged to the lawyer they'd hired to clean up after what they thought would be a quiet disappearance. I sat on the bench near the old war memorial and let the phone buzz. It kept going. 10 calls, then 15. A voicemail left, then another. By 11, it rang again, and this time I answered, not because I wanted to hear her voice, but because I needed her to hear mine. "Dad," she said, breathless, urgent, like she had just discovered fire and I was standing too close. "Emily," I replied, calm as I could manage. "What did you do?" "I mailed the truth. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand more than you think. This will ruin everything." "For who?" She paused. "You need to come talk to us," she said. "Let's handle this quietly. Quietly is how you stole from me. Quietly is how you buried your mother before she was cold. Quietly is how you turned your son into a messenger for the dead. Dad, please." "She left me everything." "No, she didn't." She was confused. "She changed her mind." "No, Emily. You changed it for her." She didn't speak for a while. And then, low and trembling, she said, "You're going to destroy this family. You already did." I hung up, turned the phone off, and sat in the sun. The day had warmed by then, and I let it touch my face like Margaret used to do in the mornings, cupping my cheeks in her hands before she poured the coffee and asked me if I'd dreamed anything worth remembering. I dreamed last night. I saw the house again. Ours. Not the one they stripped and painted and filled with furniture that didn't know our names, but the real one, with her quilts, her photos, her music in the corners and her laughter on the porch. I saw the roses blooming out back, the white one she called Helena, taller now, blooming from a root that couldn't be cut, and I saw our grandson standing at the window, holding something in his hands, a key, but not for a door, a key for a voice, a memory, a truth. I waited all day, not out of fear, but out of a strange kind of peace, like something inside me had finally stopped knocking. Around 3, I turned the phone back on. 27 missed calls, 12 voicemails, a message from Greg. "Frank, let's be reasonable. These things can be fixed. Don't let emotion guide you." A message from their lawyer. "Mr. Cole, we request that you cease all communication regarding this matter until legal counsel is arranged." A message from Emily. "You said once that family was the only thing that mattered. I'm asking you to remember that now. Please. But family doesn't lie in ink and signatures. Family lives in what's left behind when the ink dries. In the way we remember. In the way we protect. Margaret protected me in death because I failed to protect her in life. Now it was my turn. Not to hurt, not to punish, just to restore what was stolen. And if they came after me, I was ready, because some ghosts aren't meant to rest, not until the whole house is quiet again. I didn't knock this time. I didn't come to plead or to demand or to shout about rights and signatures and the slow betrayal that had unfolded room by room, document by document, inside a house that was supposed to hold memory like stone holds heat after the sun is gone. I came quietly, in the early morning before the town stirred, before the church bell rang, before Greg had time to button his collar or Emily had time to paste her calm smile back into place. I didn't park nearby. I walked slowly, coat tight to my body, the letter Margaret had written still tucked inside the breast pocket like a second set of lungs, and I moved with the kind of stillness that comes only after everything has already been burned. and what remains is only the ash that refuses to scatter. The sky was pale and low, the air sharp with frost, and as I stepped onto their porch, I noticed the light was already on in the living room. She was awake, watching maybe, waiting. I didn't stop at the front door. I circled the house, just like I used to when Emily was a little girl and had nightmares about men hiding under the floorboards, about voices coming through the walls. I'd do a full walk around the perimeter, flashlight in hand, and come back inside to tell her everything was safe, that there was nothing out there, and she'd believe me. She always did back then, before believing me became inconvenient, before truth became a negotiation. The back door was unlocked. I stepped inside. The kitchen was warm and the kettle was hissing, and on the table was a single cup already poured. Margaret's favorite mug, the one with the bluebells, the one Emily claimed had been broken in the move. But here it was, whole, waiting. I didn't drink it. I didn't touch anything. I moved through the house until I reached the hallway, and there, sitting cross-legged on the floor outside the basement door, was Peter, my grandson, still in his pajamas, clutching a piece of folded paper in one hand, the other resting gently on the floor, as if he were listening to it breathe. He looked up at me like he'd been expecting this moment all along. "She said you'd come," he whispered. "Who?" I asked, though I didn't need to. "Grandma." I knelt down slowly, knees aching with the weight of too many winters and too many goodbyes. "She talks to me through the wall," he said. "Not every night, only when I miss her." I reached out and touched his shoulder, soft and steady. "What does she say?" "She says you were the only one who remembered." He opened his hand. The drawing was folded 3 times, crumpled a bit at the edges. He held it out to me without a word, and I took it carefully, afraid that the weight of my fingers might erase whatever message it carried. I unfolded it slowly, expecting the scribbles of a child, the kind of innocent chaos that fills every fridge door in every kitchen across America. But it wasn't chaos. It was exact, deliberate. A door, drawn in brown crayon, with a golden key resting beside it, a hand extended toward the knob, and another hand, smaller, thinner, reaching up to hold the first. Above them were 2 figures, me and her. Not Margaret the way she looked in photographs, not the formal smile with pinned-up hair and a church dress, but the real Margaret, the one who wore wool socks in July and hummed without realizing, the one who cried when she laughed too hard and whispered my name like it had meaning. And she was holding Peter's hand. No words, no label, just that. I folded the drawing again, slower this time, placed it in my coat pocket beside her letter, beside the will, beside every piece of paper they tried to hide or burn or bury. "Thank you," I said. "She told me to wait here," he replied. "She said you'd know what to do." I stood and looked down at the basement door. It was closed, but not locked. The bolt that used to hang above it was gone. I could open it. I could go down. But I didn't. Not yet. Because some doors don't need to be opened to be understood. Some truths live in the knowing, not the seeing, and I already knew. I knelt again and kissed Peter's forehead. "Go back to bed," I said. "Everything's okay now." He nodded, climbed to his feet, and walked down the hall with the quiet confidence of a boy who had never been lied to by the people who loved him most. I waited until he was gone before I turned to the door again. And this time I whispered, "Thank you for waiting." No voice answered, no wind stirred, just the soft hum of the kettle in the kitchen and the warmth of a house that was finally truly awake. I didn't need to fight anymore, didn't need to scream, because she had already left the truth where it couldn't be erased, in a child's hand, in a folded drawing, in a love that knew how to leave breadcrumbs through silence. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped into the morning. The air was sharp, the sky was clean, and I was not afraid. Because Margaret hadn't left. She'd simply made a place for me to return to, one I wouldn't lose again.